Please look at me once. Annie dropped to her knees on the snow-covered road. She was wearing a worn, mud-stained protective outfit like a grape picker's work clothes. The driver slammed on the brakes. The black Bentley jerked to a violent stop, its front end only inches from her. For 1 second, no one moved. Then the bodyguards rushed out. "Get her away from the car," one guard shouted. 2 men grabbed her by the arms. She did not fight, kick, or scream at them. She only leaned harder toward the windshield, her eyes fixed on the man hidden in the back seat. "Please," she said again, her voice trembling from the cold. "Please listen to me." Inside the car, Julian Vance did not move. He frowned, irritation cutting across his controlled face. "What is it now?" Samuel Reed, his longtime assistant, glanced through the windshield at the girl kneeling in front of the car. Snow was falling hard enough to blur the headlights, but not hard enough to hide the desperation in her eyes. "Probably another disruptor, sir," Samuel said. "We just sold Black Reserve at a record price. After these auctions, there are always people who don't accept being left outside the gate." His jaw tightened. Samuel Reed, his longtime assistant, opened the passenger door before Julian finished the command. Samuel was a lean man in his 60s, careful in every movement and hard to surprise. Tonight, even he looked unsettled. "I'll handle it, sir." Julian looked past him, toward the girl. "Quickly. I have a flight." Outside, the guards tried to pull her away. One of them said, "Miss, you're trespassing. Stand up before this gets worse. Is this girl insane?" Another guard barked, his cold voice cutting through the wind. "Do you know whose car this is? You think you can throw yourself in front of it and walk away? Move before I call the sheriff and have you locked up." "I'm not insane." Annie dug her fingers harder against the hood, fighting to stay where she was. "I came here to see Mr. Julian Vance. Just 5 minutes. Tell him to look at this glass." "Let go, you filthy vineyard worker." The guard pried at her fingers one by one, his eyes full of contempt. "A girl like you thinks she has the right to bring wine to the Vance family? Get out before you make this worse. I'm not leaving. Tonight is my last chance, and I have to give this to him." Annie's voice cracked from the cold, but there was something in it that made even the guard hesitate. Samuel stepped between her and the car. "Mr. Vance does not meet strangers at his gate. Give me whatever you're holding and leave the property peacefully." The girl looked up at him. Snow melted on her cheeks, but her eyes did not lower. They were amber, strange under the headlights, too steady for someone surrounded by security. "My name is Annie Carter," she said, "and I'm not leaving until he hears my mother's name." Samuel's face changed only a little, but Julian saw it. Julian opened his door. Cold air rushed into the car. The smell of snow came first, clean and metallic. Then came another scent, so faint Julian almost dismissed it. Old oak. He paused with one foot on the ground. Ripe blackberry. Dark cherry. A thread of wild lavender moving beneath it all, not added, not perfumed, but grown into the wine like a secret that had waited years to speak. Julian stepped out. "Sir," Samuel warned quietly. Julian ignored him. His eyes were on the glass. The girl held it with both hands now, careful despite the guards gripping her sleeves. "Please smell it," she said. "That's all I'm asking." "I don't take wine from trespassers," Julian said. "No," she answered. "You take it from dead women and put your family name on it." One guard jerked her arm. "That's enough." Julian lifted one hand. "Let her go." The guard released her at once. Behind them, the mansion still glowed from the auction. Guests lingered near the front steps, wrapped in cashmere and fur, whispering as they watched. Victor Vance came down from the entrance, his tuxedo coat open, his face arranged into concern too quickly to be trusted. "Julian," Victor called. "Don't engage with her. She's the worker I told you about. Unstable. We had to dismiss her for theft." Annie's mouth tightened, but she kept her eyes on Julian. "He's lying." Victor gave a short laugh. "Of course I am. That's what people say when they're caught." Julian stood before Annie. He stared at the wine in her hand, then at her face, suspicion tightening every line of his expression. "You," he said slowly. "Who are you? Why does that wine carry this scent? Who made it?" Annie rose to her feet so quickly the guards shifted around her. "Mr. Vance, you smell it, don't you? This is the original taste of Black Reserve. The real one, not the flawed copy your company just used to celebrate tonight's award." Julian's voice lowered, but it shook in a way Samuel had never heard before. "I asked you who gave it to you. The woman who made it died in poverty." Annie's bitterness broke through, and tears mixed with the melted snow on her face. "My mother. The woman you threw away. The woman you let them brand as a traitor." "Shut your mouth," Julian roared. The old wound tore open before he could stop it. "Brother, don't listen to this crazy girl." Victor's voice cut in, too sharp, too fast. Panic hid beneath his anger as he rushed forward and reached for the wooden box in Annie's arms. Annie twisted away before he could grab it. Victor turned on the guards. "What are you doing?" "She was a seasonal worker I fired 3 days ago for sneaking around, stealing wine, and harassing staff. She is slandering the Vance family in front of our guests. Call the police and have her arrested now." The guards moved again. Annie clutched the box against her chest and looked straight at Julian. There was no fear in her face now, only exhaustion and a kind of grief too honest to perform. "Please look into my eyes," she said. "I have no reason to risk my life for a lie." Victor snapped. "Be quiet, you trash." "Enough." Julian raised one hand. It was not loud. It did not need to be. Victor froze, and a bead of sweat began to gather at his temple. Julian did not look at his brother. He looked into Annie's amber eyes, eyes full of injury, courage, and something painfully familiar. Then he turned toward Victor, and his gaze sharpened with the cold precision of a predator catching the first scent of a trap. Samuel stepped closer. "Sir, allow me to resolve this. Your flight is already close to departure." "The flight is cancelled," Julian said. Samuel went still. Julian's voice was calm now, and that made it more dangerous. "Bring the girl inside the mansion." Victor's mouth opened. "Julian, and Victor," Julian continued, finally looking at him fully. "You will not leave my sight." "Miss Carter," Samuel said, his voice low but formal, "please come inside." The mansion doors opened before Annie reached the steps. The guests were still lingering after the auction, glasses in hand, voices fading one by one as every eye turned toward her. Julian walked ahead without saying a word. Samuel stayed close to Annie's left side, not touching her, but near enough to keep anyone else from doing so. Victor followed behind them, his steps quick, his breathing uneven. His face had recovered its usual proud calm, but his eyes stayed fixed on the wooden box in Annie's arms with open hatred. "Julian, this is ridiculous," Victor said first, his tone full of superiority and contempt. "You are seriously delaying a signing flight to New York because of a con girl. Look at her. She is a ragged grape picker from the South Workers' Quarters." He stepped closer to Annie and looked her up and down. 3 days ago, I caught her sneaking around fermentation room 4, trying to replace one of our premium bottles with her cheap fermented grape water. She thinks adding a little wild lavender can fool the chairman of Vance Wines. People like her will do anything for money." Annie did not step back. She raised her head, her voice hoarse but clear. "You're scared, aren't you, Mr. Victor? You said I stole, but when I asked a housekeeper to place that bottle on Mr. Julian's tasting table, why were you the first one to rush in and smash it? You fired me right away. Not because I stole anything, but because you were afraid he would recognize the taste." "Shut your mouth," Victor snapped, his face flushing. "You filthy little trash. I tried everything to reach you, Mr. Vance," Annie said, turning to Julian. Victor moved closer to his brother and lowered his voice. "This is absurd. We can handle it privately. Let Samuel take her somewhere out of sight." Julian cut him off. "Let her finish." The words gave Annie just enough strength to keep standing. 2 days ago, I dressed as a server and tried to get into the VIP cellar to give you this notebook. Your security threw me out before I even reached the door. I wrote emails. I stood in the rain outside your corporate gate. No one answered. If I hadn't stopped your car tonight, the truth about my mother would stay buried under the control of your greedy brother. Julian did not look at Victor. "You seem very eager to get her out of my sight. I'm trying to protect you." "Enough," Julian said. He left the edge of the table and walked slowly toward Annie, ignoring his brother. "Samuel, bring her hot tea." "Julian, are you really going to indulge this?" Victor took one impatient step forward. Julian's glance cut toward him. I have my own judgment, Victor. Sit down. And do not interrupt again. Victor stopped, humiliated in front of guests who had spent years fearing his smile more than another man's anger. Julian looked at Annie, then at the box she held against her chest. You claim your mother created the taste of Black Reserve? Nora Carter, Annie said, and the name nearly broke in her throat. The woman who made it died in poverty. My mother. The woman you threw away. The woman you let them brand as a traitor. Julian's control cracked. She betrayed me, he growled. I saw the evidence 18 years ago. What are you to her? Annie lifted the old wooden box with both hands. If she betrayed you, why did she keep every memory of you? Why did she save your handkerchief, your photograph, your letters? Why did she leave me a final letter about the 18-year-old daughter standing in front of you? Julian fell silent. The room waited. Finally, he said, Give me the box. Annie hesitated. Julian's eyes narrowed. You crossed my gate in front of half of Napa Valley. You wanted me to look. I am looking. Victor gave a short laugh. An old photograph proves nothing. Nora worked here. Everyone knows that. You told everyone she was a thief, Annie said. She was dismissed for cause. She was framed. The words rang through the hall, clean and hard. Annie placed the box in Julian's hands. He opened it slowly. Inside lay the pieces of a life he had spent 18 years trying not to remember. A faded photograph of him and Nora in the east cellar, a folded letter with softened edges, a handkerchief embroidered with the Vance crest, a dried sprig of lavender, and a black notebook worn at the corners. Annie reached for the notebook and held it out. This was my mother's. Her fermentation notes, her trials, her ratios, her corrections. She wrote everything by hand because she said machines could count sugar, but they could not understand patience. Julian took it. The moment he saw the handwriting, something in his face changed. Victor stepped in at once. Any skilled forger could copy old notes. Julian, think. This girl had access to staff areas. She could have stolen archives, copied labels, staged all of this. Annie looked at him. Then why are you sweating? Someone near the back coughed softly. A few faces turned toward Victor's forehead, where moisture had gathered despite the cold air still clinging to the open doorway. Victor forced a smile. Because I'm watching a stranger insult my family in my own home. My mother endured that insult for 18 years, Annie said. You've only had to endure 5 minutes. If you feel Annie's pain in this moment, please like this video and tell us in the comments where you are watching from, because someone near you might be watching this story too. Don't forget to subscribe for more emotional and inspiring stories. Julian closed the notebook. Enough. Annie gathered her courage, expecting him to send her away. But Julian turned to Samuel. Bring the current Black Reserve. Bring an archive bottle from the first commercial release. And bring 3 clean glasses. Victor's voice sharpened. No. Julian looked at him. No? You cannot let her perform some trick in front of our guests. If it is a trick, you have nothing to fear. Victor leaned closer. This could damage the brand. Julian's eyes did not move from him. The brand can wait. Then he turned back to Samuel. And find every file on Nora Carter. Employment records, security logs, seller access, termination documents. All of it. Samuel nodded. Yes, sir. Victor stepped back half a pace. Annie saw it. Julian saw it too. The night had begun with a girl kneeling in the snow. Now the most powerful man in the room no longer looked at her as an intruder. He looked at her as a question his own blood may have been avoiding for 18 years. And somewhere beneath the polished floor of Vance Estate, the buried truth began to stir. Samuel left the hall with 2 junior staff members, and the mansion seemed to hold its breath after him. No one returned to the party. No one laughed. The musicians kept their instruments in their laps, unsure whether they had been dismissed or trapped inside something history would remember. Annie stood near the tasting table with the wooden box open beside her, her wet gloves leaving small dark marks on the polished surface. A maid brought tea in a white cup with a gold rim. Annie accepted it with both hands. Thank you, ma'am, she said. The maid, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes, paused as if the word ma'am had reached a place in her that the evening's rich compliments had not. You're welcome, honey, she whispered, then stepped back before Victor could notice her kindness. Julian saw the exchange. He also saw Annie's fingers trembling around the cup. Not from fear now. From cold, hunger, and the exhaustion of someone who had spent too many days pushing against locked doors. "How long have you been on this property?" he asked. 3 weeks, Annie said. "As a seasonal worker?" "Yes, sir." "Who hired you?" "Labor office in Street Helena. I signed through a contractor. They put me in the South workers' quarters." Victor cut in before he could stop himself. "And she was trouble from the start." Julian turned his head. Victor remembered the warning and shut his mouth, but his pride made silence look painful. Annie looked down at the tea. "I wasn't trouble. I worked. I kept my head down. I just asked too many questions about fermentation room 4. Julian's eyes sharpened. "Why that room?" "My mother wrote about it." Annie touched the edge of the black notebook. She called it the room where Black Reserve learned how to breathe. The phrase struck Julian so hard that his hand tightened at his side. Nora had always spoken about wine as if it were alive. He used to find it charming. Later, after he believed she had betrayed him, he called it theatrical. Now he heard the same language from her daughter, and it felt less like coincidence than blood speaking through memory. Victor gave a dry laugh. "Convenient." Annie looked at him. "You keep using that word like it scares me." Before Victor could answer, Samuel returned. 2 men followed with a silver tray. On it sat 3 clean glasses and 2 bottles. 1 modern Black Reserve with a flawless black label, and 1 older bottle with dark wax and a label faded at the edges. The room shifted toward the table as if the trial had been announced without anyone naming it. Samuel placed the tray before Julian. "The current release, sir, and the earliest commercial archive bottle we could retrieve without entering the sealed vault." Julian nodded. "Pour." Samuel opened the modern bottle first. The cork came free with a clean, practiced sound. He poured a measured amount into the first glass. Then he handled the older bottle with more care. Its cork resisted, then yielded. A deeper aroma rose at once, warmer and less polished. Some of the older sommeliers in the hall leaned forward before they caught themselves. Finally, Samuel gestured toward the glass Annie had brought from the snow. "May I?" Annie held it tighter. "No." Samuel stopped. Julian did not seem offended. "Why?" "Because that was my mother's last bottle. There's not much left. I carried it here in the cold with both hands. I won't let anyone pour it like it's just another sample." A few guests exchanged looks. Someone near the fireplace sighed in irritation. Annie heard it and lifted her chin. Julian said, "Then you pour it." Annie set down the tea. She removed her gloves, slowly because the wet fabric clung to her fingers. Her hands were young but rough, nails short, knuckles cracked from field work. She picked up her glass and poured a small amount into the 3rd clean glass. "Not much, just enough." Victor muttered, "This is humiliating." Julian said, "For whom?" The question landed quietly, and Victor looked away. Julian pushed the first glass toward Annie. The current Black Reserve. Annie did not reach for it right away. "You want me to taste it in front of everyone?" "You demanded to be heard in front of everyone." "I demanded to be seen." Julian paused. The correction was small, but it found its mark. He said, "Then let them see what you know." Annie lifted the first glass. She turned it once, not like the trained tasters in the room, not with show, but with the plain care of someone listening. She smelled it, closed her eyes, then opened them. "Too much new oak," she said. "The fruit is expensive but tired. Blackberry, plum, a little cassis. But it's wearing a suit that doesn't fit. The yeast is controlled too tightly. Clean, yes. Safe, yes. But the middle is hollow." A younger sommelier frowned, offended. Harold Finch, the retired master taster with the cane, did not frown. He watched Annie, as if he had just heard a note only trained ears could catch. Victor folded his arms. That description could come from any wine blog. Annie moved to the second glass. The archived bottle. The moment she lifted it, her face changed. Her anger softened into something worse. Grief. She smelled again. Longer this time. The room grew so quiet the fire could be heard shifting in the hearth. "This one had courage," she said. No one laughed. Annie swallowed. "Wild lavender from the South Ridge. Not added. It came in through the yeast bloom. Dark cherry, blackberry skin, old oak but not burned. Longer rest before the second racking. Whoever made this didn't force the wine to become expensive. She waited until it became honest. Julian's face went still. Those words were not copied from a label. They were too close to Nora's mouth, Nora's mind, Nora's way of standing in a cellar with her hand on a barrel as if she could feel the future inside it. Harold Finch stepped closer. "May I?" Julian nodded. Harold smelled the second glass, then the first. His brows drew together. "She's not guessing." Victor snapped. "Harold, don't encourage this. I'm too old to flatter liars," Harold said, "and too old to fear men who need flattery." A small sound moved through the guests. Some shock, some approval quickly swallowed. Annie lifted the third glass last. Her mother's wine. The one carried through snow, guarded under a cheap jacket, saved from a life that had left almost nothing else behind. She brought it to her nose and closed her eyes. For a second, she was not in the Vance mansion. She was in a narrow kitchen with a rattling heater and a towel stuffed under the door to block the winter air. Nora Carter sat at the table in a faded robe, too thin, too tired, but still correcting Annie's grip on the glass. "Don't chase flavor, Annie. Let it come tell you what happened." Annie opened her eyes. "This one is poor," she said. Victor smiled. Annie looked at Julian. "Not bad, poor. There's a difference. It didn't have the right cellar. It didn't have the right barrels. My mother made it while she was sick, with tools she had to wash in a kitchen sink. But underneath all that, the structure is the same as the archive bottle. Same patience, same lavender, same living finish. This is what your Black Reserve was before men started polishing it for applause." The words hit the hall harder than shouting would have. Julian reached for the third glass. Annie almost stopped him, then let him take it. He smelled it. His composure cracked, not fully. Julian Vance was too disciplined to fall apart in a room full of people. But Samuel saw his breath catch. Harold saw his eyes lower. Annie saw his thumb press against the stem as if he needed something solid to keep him standing. Julian tasted. 18 years disappeared. Nora's laugh. Nora's hand covering his when he reached too soon for a barrel sample. Nora saying, "You keep trying to command things that only open when they're trusted." Nora beneath the yellow cellar light, telling him she had made something that could outlive both of them if he was brave enough to honor it. He had honored the wine, not the woman. Julian set the glass down. Victor spoke quickly. "A clever imitation. That's all. She could have studied the profile. She could have found old tasting notes." Annie turned to him. "Where would I find notes about lavender if your company removed my mother's name from everything?" Victor's mouth opened, then closed. Samuel returned from the side corridor carrying a thin file. "Sir, the full archive will take longer. But we found Nora Carter's basic employment record." Julian took it. The first page was plain. Nora Elaine Carter, assistant cellar technician, later promoted to fermentation specialist. The promotion bore Julian's signature. He remembered signing it after Nora saved the October batch everyone else had given up on. He turned the page. Termination for theft of proprietary yeast culture. Breach of confidentiality. Suspected collusion with outside buyer. There it was. The old poison in clean corporate language. Julian read the signature at the bottom. Nora Carter. Except it was wrong. He stared at it longer than he should have needed to. Annie noticed. "That isn't her handwriting." Victor laughed too loudly. "And you would know?" Annie opened the notebook and laid it beside the file. Nora's real handwriting slanted with pressure at the start of every capital N. The signature on the termination form was flatter, rushed, and missing the small hook Nora made at the end of her last name. Harold leaned in. Samuel did too. Julian did not speak. He remembered Nora signing holiday cards for staff. He remembered her writing notes on barrel tags. He remembered the way her C curled like a vine. This signature was not hers. Victor's voice lowered. "Julian, you are tired. This girl is manipulating." Julian closed the file. Samuel. "Yes, sir. I want the security logs from the night Nora Carter was accused. I want cellar access records. I want personnel statements. I want every document connected to Victor's report." Victor stiffened. "My report?" Julian looked at him. "You were the one who brought me the evidence. That was 18 years ago. Then it has had 18 years to wait for us." Annie stood very still. She had imagined this moment so many times. Julian refusing her. Julian laughing. Julian ordering guards to drag her away. She had not imagined this, the first thin sound of a locked door beginning to open, but hope frightened her more than anger. Anger had kept her warm outside the gate. Hope could cut deeper if it failed. Julian turned to her. You said Nora left a letter. Annie touched the folded paper in the box but did not hand it over yet. She wrote it to you. May I read it? Annie looked at his face, searching for the man her mother had loved and the man who had abandoned her. She did not know which one stood before her. My mother carried your name like a wound, she said. If I give you this, don't treat it like evidence. Treat it like the last thing she never got to say. For the first time that night, Julian's voice lost its edge. I will. Annie placed the letter in his hand. As his fingers closed around it, Victor stepped backward again, almost too little to notice. Almost. And in that small retreat, Annie understood something with a certainty that did not need proof. Victor was not afraid of scandal. He was afraid of Nora Carter's voice coming back from the grave. Julian did not open the letter at once. For a man who had signed contracts worth hundreds of millions without blinking, the thin folded paper in his hand seemed to weigh more than the whole estate. He turned it over once. The paper was old, softened at the creases, the ink slightly faded where time and poor storage had worked on it. His name was written across the front in Nora's hand. Julian, not Mr. Vance, not Julian Vance, just Julian, the way she used to say it when she was trying to bring him back from anger. Victor watched from a few feet away, his face still arranged into control, but his hands betrayed him. His thumb rubbed hard against the side of his index finger. Annie noticed it because her mother had taught her to watch hands. People's mouths could lie. Hands often forgot. Julian unfolded the letter. The room went quiet in a way that felt almost rude, as if every rich guest had suddenly realized they were standing too close to another person's wound. He read the first line. Julian, if this letter reaches you, then at least one door between us has not been locked by someone else. His jaw tightened. He read on. I did not steal the yeast culture. I did not sell your family's formula. I did not leave with another man. I went to the East Gate 3 times. I called the office until they stopped transferring me. I wrote to you because I believed, maybe foolishly, that if you heard me once, you would know my voice from their lies. Julian's breathing changed. Annie stood still. But every word cut through her, too. She had read the letter only twice before tonight. The first time, she had cried until she could not see. The second time, she had stopped crying and started planning. Julian continued, I am carrying your child. I found out after the day they threw me out. I wanted to tell you in person. I wanted you to look at me before deciding who I was, but they said you had already chosen to believe I betrayed you. His eyes stopped moving. The hall seemed to tilt around him. Annie's words outside the gate came back. Please look into my eyes. I have no reason to risk my life for a lie. Julian looked up slowly. You knew this existed? He asked Victor. Victor's expression hardened. No, it was too quick. Julian folded the letter halfway, then unfolded it again as if putting it away would be another kind of cowardice. Samuel. Yes, sir. Where is Mrs. Ruth? Annie looked at him sharply. You know her? She has worked harvest seasons here longer than some board members have been alive. If anyone remembers Nora, she will. Samuel nodded and spoke quietly into his phone. The order moved through the mansion faster than gossip. Within minutes, an older black woman was brought through the side entrance with snow on her coat and worry in her face. Mrs. Ruth looked first at Annie. Child, she said, walking straight to her. You all right? Annie's composure nearly broke at the sound of a familiar voice. I'm standing. Mrs. Ruth touched her cheek with cold fingers. Standing is enough some nights. Victor frowned. Why is she here? Julian answered without looking at him. Because I asked. Mrs. Ruth turned to Julian with the kind of respect older working people used without surrendering their dignity. Mr. Vance. Mrs. Ruth, Julian said. You remember Nora Carter? Her eyes narrowed. I remember folks who were done wrong. A few guests shifted. Julian accepted the rebuke. I need the truth, he said. Mrs. Ruth looked at Victor, then at Annie's open box, then at the letter in Julian's hand. Truth? Had a hard time getting through these walls back then. Julian's face tightened. Tell me, Mrs. Ruth drew in a slow breath. Nora was the best nose this estate ever had. Better than the French consultants, better than the men with diplomas framed on office walls. She could walk past a barrel and tell you if it needed air, rest, or prayer. She saved the October batch when everyone else said it was ruined. The first Black Reserve, Annie said quietly. Mrs. Ruth nodded. That wine was hers before it was ever yours. Victor stepped forward. This is sentimental nonsense. She was a field worker with a good memory. Mrs. Ruth turned on him so quickly the room seemed to flinch. No, Mr. Victor. I was a field worker. Nora was a winemaker. And you knew it. Victor's mouth thinned. Julian said, The accusation. What did you see? Mrs. Ruth's gaze moved to the floor for a moment, as though the memory still lay there. I saw Nora crying outside the yeast vault that morning. Not guilty. Crying. Betrayed crying. She kept saying, Let me talk to Julian. Security wouldn't let her pass the inner hall. Later, we heard she signed a confession, but I never believed it. Nora would rather starve than put her name under a lie. She did starve, Annie said, the words small but sharp. Just slower. Mrs. Ruth closed her eyes. Julian looked at the notebook again, then the file, then the letter. Each piece was separate, but together they were becoming a shape he could no longer deny. Samuel returned with another folder and a tablet. Sir, we found partial security logs from the night in question. The full footage is missing from the active archive, but the access record remains. Victor's face changed. It was brief, but clear. Julian took the tablet. Read it. Samuel glanced once at Victor, then began. East cellar access. Nora Carter, 8:12 p.m. Fermentation room 4, 8:19 p.m. Yeast vault access attempted at 8:43 p.m. Denied. Executive override at 8:46 p.m. Security camera interruption begins 8:47 p.m. Recording resumes 9:04 p.m. Julian's voice was flat. Who used the executive override? Samuel hesitated. Say it, Julian ordered. Victor Vance. The room inhaled as one body. Victor laughed, but the sound had no strength. Of course, my name is there. I was handling the crisis. I had authority. Julian looked at him. Before or after Nora supposedly stole what she could not access? Victor's eyes flickered. Annie felt her heartbeat in her throat. For 18 years, her mother had been buried beneath one clean official story. Now the dirt was moving. Mrs. Ruth spoke softly. Powerful men called her a thief because it was easier than admitting they needed her. Julian turned to Annie. Did Nora ever tell you about me? Annie looked down at the box. Not much. She said you had a cold way of protecting a warm heart. Then, after she got sick, she stopped saying your name. That hurt him more than accusation. She shouldn't have had to carry this alone, he said. No, Annie answered. She shouldn't have. Victor suddenly moved toward the table. Samuel blocked him before he reached the notebook. Careful, Samuel said. Victor's mask slipped. You're making a mistake, Julian. A terrible one. Julian stared at his brother. The mistake was made 18 years ago. Then he turned to Samuel. Seal every archive room. No one enters without my permission. Pull phone logs, payroll records, legal correspondence, security tapes, everything tied to Nora Carter. Samuel nodded. And the guests? Julian looked around the hall, at the people who had applauded his wine, praised his family, and never asked whose name had been left off the bottle. They may stay and witness the truth, he said, or leave and explain why they were afraid of it. No one moved. Annie looked at Julian, still not trusting him, not forgiving him, but seeing something shift. For the first time, he was not asking her to prove why she belonged in the room. He was asking the room to prove why Nora had been forced out of it. Julian's order moved through the mansion like a change in weather. Staff who had spent the evening pouring wine and clearing silverware now hurried toward archive rooms, security offices, and locked corridors that most guests never saw. The party was over, though nobody had announced it. What remained was quieter and more dangerous. Annie stood beside Mrs. Ruth near the tasting table, still holding the cup of tea Samuel had brought her. The warmth had reached her hands, but not the place in her chest where fear sat. She had wanted this night to force the truth into the open. She had not prepared herself for the possibility that the truth might actually answer. Julian stayed near the center of the room, Nora's letter in one hand and the employment file in the other. He looked less like the untouchable man from the magazine covers now. He looked like a man reading the inventory of everything he had lost and helped destroy. Victor paced near the fireplace, watched by two guards who were no longer taking orders from him. He had recovered some of his color, but not his ease. Every few moments his eyes moved toward the hallway leading to the archive rooms, then back to Julian. "You're letting this become a circus," Victor said. Julian did not answer. Victor turned to the guests. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this embarrassment. My brother is clearly under emotional strain. We will have this matter resolved privately." "Sit down, Victor," Julian said. Victor laughed under his breath. "You don't get to command me like staff." Julian looked at him then. "Tonight, I'm beginning to think I should have treated my staff with more trust and my family with less." The words struck harder because he did not raise his voice. Mrs. Ruth gave the smallest nod, as if some old account had just received its first payment. Samuel returned with two security technicians and a gray-haired woman in a dark suit. "Sir, this is Miss Helen Price from Legal Compliance." She was still on site for the auction paperwork. Helen Price adjusted her glasses and looked at the room with the expression of someone who had seen wealthy families turn ugly and knew where to stand when they did. "Mr. Vance, before anything else is handled publicly, I advise we secure the documents and record all statements from this point forward." "Do it," Julian said. Victor snapped. "Helen, you work for Vance Wines." She looked at him. "I work for the company, Mr. Vance, not for your comfort." A few guests looked down into their glasses to hide their reactions. One of the technicians placed a laptop on the tasting table. Samuel set beside it a metal archive box that had been retrieved from long-term storage. Dust clung to the lid. A white label read, "Carter, Nora E. Incident Review, October." Annie saw her mother's name typed on that cold label and felt anger rise again. A whole life reduced to an incident. A woman who could smell rain and grapes, who sang low hymns over boiling jars, who worked through fevers because rent did not wait, filed away like a broken tool. Julian touched the box but did not open it immediately. "Annie," he said. She stiffened at the sound of her name in his mouth. "Do you want to sit?" "No, sir. You don't have to keep standing. My mother stood outside your gate 3 times, Annie said. "I can stand inside your house for one night." Julian accepted that without argument. "Then stay near Mrs. Ruth." "I don't need protection, I believe," Julian said. "But I do." That answer caught her off guard. Samuel opened the archive box. Inside were old incident reports, printed emails, access logs, photographs, and a sealed envelope marked confidential. Helen Price put on gloves and began sorting. The first document was the original accusation. Victor had written it. His signature sat clean and bold at the bottom. Julian read aloud enough for the room to understand. Nora Carter observed removing proprietary yeast culture from restricted storage. Suspected intention to transfer property to outside distributor. Personal relationship with outside distributor believed to be motive. Annie looked at Victor. "What distributor?" Victor shrugged. "Ask your mother. She's dead." Convenient again. Mrs. Ruth stepped forward. "Say that word one more time about that dead woman, and you'll show this room exactly how small you are." Victor's eyes flashed, but he did not answer her. Helen lifted a second page. "The named outside distributor is Daniel Mercer." Julian looked up sharply. "Mercer?" Samuel nodded. "He supplied barrels from Oregon for several seasons. Small operation. Went bankrupt a year later." Julian's memory moved. Daniel Mercer had been older than Nora by at least 20 years, married, and more interested in payment schedules than romance. The idea that Nora had run away with him had always felt ugly enough to be believable when Julian was wounded. Now it felt lazy. "Find Mercer," Julian said. Samuel stepped away to make the call. Helen continued reading. Witness statement from Elaine Porter, cellar assistant. She claimed she saw Miss Carter near the yeast vault with a wrapped package. Mrs. Ruth frowned. Elaine wasn't working that wing that night. Her boy had pneumonia. I covered part of her shift. Helen looked at her. You are certain? I was the one who drove her home. Folks remember nights when children can't breathe. Annie looked at Mrs. Ruth with quiet gratitude. Older people carried the past differently. Not like a file. Like weather in their bones. Helen made a note. The technician pulled up the old access log on the laptop. Lines of text appeared on the large wall screen normally used for auction presentations. Now, instead of bottle prices and vineyard maps, the guests saw timestamps from 18 years earlier. East cellar door, Nora Carter, 8:12 p.m. Fermentation room 4, Nora Carter, Oui 10, à 9 p.m. Yeast vault entry attempt. Nora Carter credential, 8:43 p.m. Denied. Executive override. Victor Vance, 8:46 p.m. Camera interruption, 8:47 p.m. to 9:04 p.m. Julian read the lines twice. Her credential was denied. Helen nodded. According to this, Miss Carter never entered the yeast vault. Someone tried with her credential and failed. Then an executive override opened it. Victor's voice stayed smooth, but his face had tightened. I told you, I responded to a breach. 3 minutes before the cameras went dark? Annie asked. Victor turned on her. You know nothing about how an estate operates. I know when a story starts bending around one man. Julian looked at Samuel, who had returned with his phone in hand. Mercer? Samuel's expression had changed. Daniel Mercer is alive. Retired in Oregon. I reached his daughter. She says he is willing to speak by video, if this concerns Nora Carter. Victor moved before anyone expected it. He reached for the archive box, but one of the guards caught his arm. Papers shifted, but did not fall. Let go of me, Victor hissed. Julian did not move. Why are you reaching for old paper if it proves nothing? Victor pulled free and straightened his jacket. Because you are humiliating this family. No, Julian said. I think you did that years ago. I'm just late finding out. Samuel placed his phone on the table and connected it to the room screen. After a few seconds, an elderly man appeared, thin-faced, sitting in a kitchen with wood cabinets behind him. His daughter adjusted the camera, then stepped away. Mr. Mercer, Julian said. This is Julian Vance. The old man stared at him for a long moment. Took you long enough. The room went still. Julian's face tightened. You knew Nora Carter? Yes. And before anybody in that fancy room repeats the old filth, I never ran off with that woman. I never bought yeast from her. I never touched a page of her work. Nora Carter came to me once after she was fired. She was pregnant, scared, and proud enough to refuse money even when she needed it. Annie's hand flew to her mouth. Julian closed his eyes briefly. Mercer continued, his voice rough with age. She asked if I could get a letter to you. I said I'd try. Next day, Victor Vance came to my warehouse with a lawyer, told me if I involved myself, my contracts would disappear. They did anyway. Victor said nothing. Julian opened his eyes. Did Nora say whose child she carried? Mercer looked directly into the camera. Yours. She said she had tried to tell you, but every road led back to your brother. Annie felt Mrs. Ruth's arm come around her shoulders. She had not realized she was shaking until someone steadied her. Victor's voice finally broke through. A bankrupt supplier with a grudge. That's your witness? Mercer leaned toward the camera. No, son. I'm an old man with not much left to lose. That makes me harder to scare than I used to be. Helen Price wrote quickly. Julian stared at Victor, and the room no longer felt like a mansion. It felt like a courtroom without a judge. Samuel, Julian said, each word controlled. Contact an independent lab. Tonight. I want DNA testing arranged under legal witness. Annie looked at him sharply. No. Julian turned to her. I didn't come here to prove I belong to you, she said. I came to prove my mother didn't steal. He took the blow in silence. Then he said, You're right. Her name comes first. Annie's eyes burned. Julian set Nora's letter on the table. Careful now, as if the paper were alive. But if you are my daughter, then Victor did not only steal a formula. He stole 18 years from a child. I need to know how much truth I failed to protect. Annie wanted to hate him for saying it gently. Hate was easier when people stayed cruel. She looked at Mrs. Ruth. Mrs. Ruth squeezed her shoulder. Your blood is yours, baby. Nobody gets to use it against you unless you hand them that power. Annie looked back at Julian. If I agree, it doesn't mean I forgive you. I know. It doesn't mean I want your money. I know. And if that test says what my mother already knew, I keep her name. Julian's voice lowered. You should. That answer weakened something she had used as armor. Helen Price stepped forward. We can arrange a legally witnessed sample tonight, with full chain of custody. Results may be expedited, but not instant. Julian nodded. Do it. Victor laughed again, but no one listened anymore. Annie looked at the 3 glasses on the table, the polished lie, the buried past, and the poor wine her mother had made with dying hands. The room had not given Nora justice yet, but it had stopped laughing at her. For the first time that night, Annie allowed herself one breath that did not feel like survival. Then Samuel's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and his face hardened. Julian noticed. What is it? Samuel looked at Victor before answering. The sealed vault logs just came in, sir. There is another access record from that night. After the cameras went dark, someone removed 3 pages from Nora Carter's original notebook. Victor went pale. Julian's voice turned quiet. Then we find those pages. Julian's order settled over the room, but finding the missing pages was not as simple as opening another box. The sealed vault sat beneath the north wing, behind 2 steel doors and a climate-controlled corridor, where the oldest Vance records were kept with more care than most families gave their dead. Only 3 living men had authorization to enter without board approval: Julian, Victor, and Samuel. Victor noticed every pair of eyes shift toward him. He gave a cold smile, but it sat badly on his face. You're all staring as if paper can convict a man. No, Julian said. Paper usually protects men like us. That is why I want to see what was removed. Helen Price closed the archive folder and slipped it into an evidence sleeve. Mr. Vance, if these pages were removed 18 years ago, they may no longer be on the property. Samuel turned from his phone. There may be a secondary record. The vault system photographed documents during intake beginning that year. Low resolution, but enough to confirm page headings. Victor's eyes flashed. That system was experimental. Half those scans were corrupted. Samuel looked at him. You remember that very clearly. I was running operations. You said earlier you were only responding to a crisis. The room caught the contradiction. Victor's mouth hardened, and for once he did not answer. Julian moved toward the corridor. Open the vault. Samuel nodded to 2 guards. No one leaves this hall without Mr. Vance's permission. A few guests protested quietly, but no one challenged Julian directly. In Napa Valley, money had manners until power told it to sit down. Annie followed Julian, still holding the wooden box. Mrs. Ruth walked beside her, one hand at her elbow, not guiding her, just reminding her she was not alone. Victor came last, flanked by guards who no longer pretended they were there for his comfort. The corridor to the north wing was colder than the grand hall. The party sounds faded behind them. Their footsteps echoed against stone that had been laid by workers whose names were never framed on the walls. Annie noticed those walls were lined with portraits of Vance men, stern fathers, proud sons, pale faces in dark suits, not one worker, not one woman holding shears, not one pair of brown hands that had harvested the grapes. Mrs. Ruth saw her looking. Funny thing about houses like this, she murmured, they hang the faces that owned the land, not the ones who kept it alive. Julian heard her. He did not turn around, but his shoulders tightened. At the vault entrance, Samuel placed his palm on a scanner and entered a code. Julian did the same. The first steel door unlocked with a low mechanical sound. The second door required a physical key from Julian's ring. When it opened, cool, dry air moved across Annie's face, carrying the scent of paper, dust, cork, and old money. Inside, shelves stretched along the walls. Archive boxes were labeled by year and category. Bottles rested in dark racks behind glass. There were leather ledgers, estate maps, acquisition contracts, and framed awards waiting in storage for whatever future event needed history as decoration. Samuel led them to a terminal near the back wall. The missing pages should have been scanned under fermentation research. October file series. Helen opened her legal pad. I'll record every action. Victor stood with his arms folded. This is theater. Annie looked at him. Then why do you look like you forgot your lines? Mrs. Ruth let out a quiet sound that might have been a laugh if the night had been kinder. Samuel typed. Several old file names appeared. Some opened to blurred scans. Others showed error marks. He searched Nora Carter, Black Reserve Trial, Wild Fermentation, South Ridge Lavender. For several minutes, nothing useful appeared. Victor exhaled loudly. Enough. Are we finished humiliating ourselves? Julian did not move. Keep searching. Samuel tried another term from Nora's notebook. Second silence. A file appeared. No one spoke. Samuel opened it. The scan was grainy, but the handwriting was visible. Nora's handwriting. 3 pages. Photographed before they had been removed from the physical notebook. Julian leaned closer. The first page was titled, Black Reserve Original Trial Authorship Notes. Annie's hand went to her mouth. Samuel enlarged the scan. The letters sharpened enough to read, I, Nora Elaine Carter, record this formula not as property of the Vance family, but as the result of my own fermentation trials conducted between September and October. Julian believes the estate will honor my name. I want to believe him. But Victor has asked twice where I keep my private ratios, and I do not trust the way he smiles when he says family legacy. Julian's face drained of color. Victor stepped forward. That proves nothing. She was paranoid. Helen said, Please remain where you are, Mr. Vance. The second page held trial ratios, yeast behavior notes, and one line written with heavier pressure. Wild lavender note must remain natural. If forced, it becomes perfume. If patient, it becomes memory. Annie closed her eyes. She had heard her mother say that once while stirring a cloudy jar in their kitchen. The third page was more personal. If anything happens to my position here, these pages prove the original work was mine. I have begun feeling sick in the mornings. I have not told Julian yet. I am afraid, but not of the child. I am afraid of the house around him. Houses like this can swallow women who come in through the service door. Mrs. Ruth whispered, Lord have mercy. Julian stepped back as if the floor had shifted under him. Annie stared at the screen. Her mother had known. Not everything. Not the shape of the trap, but enough to be afraid. Enough to leave a record. Victor spoke sharply. This is inadmissible nonsense. A private diary. Emotional speculation. Julian turned to him. You removed these pages. I did no such thing. Your access code opened the vault after the cameras went dark. As operations director, Nora wrote that she feared you, because she wanted to turn you against me. Julian's voice stayed low. She was pregnant. Victor's eyes flickered, and the room saw it. Annie saw it most clearly. You knew, she said. Victor looked at her. I knew nothing about you. That's not what I said. Annie stepped closer, the box tight in her hands. You knew my mother was pregnant. Victor looked to Julian, then to Helen, then away. Julian's face changed. Until that moment, he had been a wounded man gathering facts. Now he looked like something older and colder had woken in him. Answer her, Julian said. Victor's composure cracked around the edges. Nora said many things when she realized she was losing her position. Mrs. Ruth shook her head. That ain't an answer. Helen Price spoke into her recorder. Mr. Victor Vance has declined to directly answer whether he knew Nora Carter was pregnant at the time of termination. Victor turned on her. Turn that off. No. Julian took one step toward his brother. Did she tell you she was carrying my child? Victor swallowed. For 18 years, he had lived inside a lie so well furnished he had mistaken it for a home. But lies had seams, and tonight too many hands were pulling at them. She came to the office, Victor said finally. Hysterical. Making claims. Annie's breath stopped. Julian's voice went quiet. What claims? Victor looked at him with resentment that had waited years for permission. That she loved you, that you would believe her, that she was pregnant, that the child was yours. She thought that would save her. Mrs. Ruth reached for Annie as the girl swayed. Julian did not move. His face had gone still, in a way that frightened even Samuel. And what did you do? Julian asked. Victor's laugh was small and bitter. I protected you. I protected the company. You were ready to throw away a century of Vance work for a cellar girl who knew how to flatter your loneliness. The words hung in the vault like smoke. Annie stepped forward before anyone could stop her. My mother did not flatter him. She built the wine you sold tonight. Victor looked at her, finally dropping the polished mask. Your mother forgot her place. That was the sentence. Not the theft, not the supposed affair, not the business excuses. That was the old truth beneath all the paperwork. Julian heard it. So did every person in the vault. Mrs. Ruth's voice was low. There it is. Julian turned to Samuel. Call the board chair. Call outside counsel. Call the sheriff's office. Victor is removed from authority. Effective immediately pending investigation. Victor stared. You would choose this girl over your own brother? Julian looked at Annie, then at Nora's scanned pages, then back at Victor. No. I am choosing the truth you stole from all of us. Victor's lips parted, but no answer came. Samuel moved to make the calls. Helen sealed the digital scan and began documenting the chain of custody. Mrs. Ruth guided Annie to a chair near the archive table. But Annie did not sit. She kept looking at the screen, at her mother's handwriting enlarged on the wall of the house that had tried to erase her. Julian approached her slowly. I didn't know, he said. Annie's eyes were wet, but her voice held. You didn't ask hard enough. He absorbed that like a sentence he deserved. No, he said, I didn't. For the first time, the space between them held no shouting, no guards, no accusation loud enough to hide behind. Just a dead woman's handwriting, a daughter who had carried it through snow, and a man finally standing inside the cost of his own pride. Then Samuel returned, phone still in hand. The lab is ready to receive samples under legal witness, he said, and the sheriff is on the way. Julian nodded, but his eyes stayed on Annie. The truth had opened one door. Blood would open the next. They returned from the vault in a different order than they had entered. Julian walked beside Annie now, not ahead of her. Mrs. Ruth stayed on Annie's other side. Samuel followed with Helen Price, carrying sealed copies of the scanned pages, the old termination file, and Nora's letter in separate evidence sleeves. Victor came behind them under guard, no longer pretending the night was under his control. The grand hall had changed while they were downstairs. The guests had grown quieter, older somehow. Men who had paid fortunes for bottles an hour earlier now held untouched glasses. Women who had whispered about Annie's muddy clothes avoided her eyes. A few staff members stood along the walls, still in uniform, watching with a kind of careful hope they did not dare show too openly. Annie noticed one of them, the housekeeper who had brought her tea. The woman gave a small nod. Annie returned it. Some gestures did not need to be large to matter. Samuel led them into a private salon off the main hall. It had green walls, heavy curtains, and shelves filled with books that looked purchased by the yard. A fire burned low. Helen Price set the documents on a round table and spoke with the estate physician, Dr. Mason, who had arrived with a medical kit and a face tight with professionalism. 2 samples, Helen said. Mr. Julian Vance and Miss Annie Carter. Chain of custody witnessed by myself, Dr. Mason, Samuel Reed, and if she agrees, Mrs. Ruth. Mrs. Ruth lifted her chin. I agree. Annie stood near the fireplace, arms wrapped around Nora's box. She had faced guards, Victor, a room full of wealthy strangers, and her mother's buried words, yet the thought of a cotton swab inside her cheek made her stomach twist. Not because it would hurt, because it might prove what she had wanted and feared since the night she opened the box. Julian seemed to understand. He did not come too close. You don't have to do this tonight, he said. Annie looked at him. If I wait, your brother gets another night to move things, call people, burn what he forgot to hide. Victor, standing near the door between 2 guards, gave a bitter smile. Listen to her. Already talking like a Vance. Annie turned. No. I talk like Nora Carter's daughter, Mrs. Ruth said. Amen to that. Julian's eyes stayed on Victor. One more word to her, and you'll wait for the sheriff in the storage room. Victor laughed softly. You always did perform nobility well when people were watching. Julian took a step toward him, but Annie spoke first. Let him talk, she said. Men like him tell the truth when they think they're insulting somebody. Victor's smile faded. Dr. Mason cleared his throat. Miss Carter, may we proceed? Annie nodded. The swab took only seconds. Dr. Mason sealed it in a small tube, labeled it, and passed it to Helen, who read the label aloud before placing it in a tamper-proof bag. Then Julian gave his sample. He did it without looking away from Annie, and she wished he wouldn't. His attention felt too heavy now. Too late, too full of things he had no right to feel before she decided what to do with him. Helen signed. Samuel signed. Mrs. Ruth signed slowly, writing each letter as if her name were standing guard for Nora. Dr. Mason placed the bags in a medical transport case. The courier is waiting. With expedited processing, we may have confirmation by morning. Morning, Annie repeated. After everything, the word sounded ordinary. Morning meant coffee, cold floors, alarm clocks, people going to work. Annie wondered how the world could still have morning after a night like this. Julian turned to Samuel. Send it. Samuel left with the doctor. For the first time, Annie and Julian stood in the same room without evidence between them. No glass, no notebook, no screen, no letter. Just the space. Julian looked toward the fire. Your mother hated rooms like this. Annie did not answer. She said rich people filled rooms with books they never read and wine they never listened to. Despite herself, Annie almost smiled. She said that? She said worse. What did you say back? I was young enough to think she was teasing me. She probably was. A little. Julian's mouth moved, not quite a smile. Then it faded. Did she suffer long? Annie's hand tightened on the box. Long enough. He nodded, accepting the boundary. I'm sorry. That's small. I know. No, she said, looking at him now. I don't think you do. Sorry is what people say when they bump your shoulder in a grocery store. My mother died with people calling her a thief. She died worrying that if I came here, you would look at me the same way you looked at her that last day. Julian's face tightened. I never saw her that day. Annie froze. He continued carefully. Victor told me she refused to see me. He told me she had already left the property. Annie looked toward Victor. Victor was silent. Julian's voice lowered. I was in the West office, waiting like a fool for my pride to calm down. I thought if she loved me, she would come explain. She was at the gate asking for me while I sat inside punishing her for not arriving. Mrs. Ruth closed her eyes. Lord, pride is an expensive disease. Annie felt the sentence settle into her bones. For years, she had pictured Julian turning his face away from Nora in person. Now a different cruelty appeared. Two people standing on the same land, separated by a door another man kept locked, both too wounded or proud to break it down. It did not forgive Julian, but it changed the shape of the wound. Victor finally spoke, voice low. You make it sound simple. It wasn't. The company was fragile then. Father had just died. Investors were circling. You were unstable over that woman. I did what was necessary. Julian turned. Necessary for whom? For all of us. For you. Victor's eyes sharpened. You think I enjoyed watching you throw your future at a woman who did not belong here? The room went cold. Annie looked at him. There it is again. Victor realized too late what he had said. Julian stared at his brother. Did not belong here. Victor lifted his chin. You know what I mean. I'm afraid I do. Victor pointed at Annie. Look at her, Julian. Mud on her clothes, field hands, no education in our world. And she walks in here claiming inheritance through sentiment and cheap theater. Nora was the same. Talented, yes. But talent does not make someone family. Annie stepped forward before Mrs. Ruth could stop her. My mother was family when you needed her hands. She was family when her formula saved your harvest. She was family when her name could be hidden behind yours. She stopped being family when she asked to be honored. Victor sneered. You've practiced that. No, Annie said. I lived it. The door opened, and Samuel returned without Dr. Mason. His eyes moved once over the room and settled on Julian. The samples are en route. Julian nodded. Good. Samuel hesitated. The sheriff's office has arrived at the outer gate. They are asking whether this is a trespass complaint or an internal matter. Victor spoke at once. Trespass and defamation. Julian did not look at him. Internal matter. Evidence preservation. Possible fraud. Samuel gave the smallest nod. Understood. Victor's face twisted. You would bring law enforcement into Vance's business? Julian answered. You did when you wanted her arrested. The words shut the room down. Annie looked at the fire because if she looked at Julian too long, she might see the man her mother had waited for. She did not want that. Not yet. Mrs. Wu touched her arm. You need food, child. I'm fine. You are 18. Fine is what 18-year-olds say when they're about to fall over. Julian turned to Samuel. Have the kitchen prepare something. Just coffee, Annie said. Mrs. Ruth gave her a look. Annie sighed. And toast. Soup, Mrs. Ruth said. And soup. Annie muttered. For a moment, the smallest human thing entered the room. An old woman fussing over a girl who had carried too much. A billionaire watching as if he had forgotten food could be care, not service. Julian said quietly. Nora liked tomato soup with pepper. Annie's eyes moved to him. She made it when rent was due. Said pepper made poor soup feel brave. Julian looked down. Samuel left again to speak with the kitchen and the deputies. Helen Price remained near the evidence, sorting copies, marking times. Victor sat stiffly in a chair, anger held tight beneath his polished surface. Annie lowered herself onto the edge of a sofa at last. Her knees ached. When she looked down, she saw dried mud on the expensive rug and almost stood again. Julian noticed. Leave it. It'll stain. So did what happened here. She did not know what to say to that. Outside the tall windows, snow kept falling over the vines, covering tracks, roofs, roads, and old sins with the same white silence. But inside the Vance mansion, silence had begun to fail. Annie held Nora's box in her lap and waited for morning. Julian stood across from her, waiting too. Between them sat 18 years, a dead woman's name, and a test neither of them could hurry. The soup came in a white bowl on a silver tray, which made Annie almost laugh. Tomato soup. Black pepper on top. 2 slices of buttered toast cut into triangles. It looked like something a child might eat after school, except the spoon was heavy enough to belong in a museum. Mrs. Ruth took the tray from the young server before anyone else could fuss with it. Thank you, sweetheart. The server gave Annie a quick glance. Yes, ma'am. Annie noticed the girl's hands, red from dishwater, nervous from standing in a room where rich people turned every mistake into a stain. Annie gave her a small nod, and the girl relaxed a little before leaving. Eat, Mrs. Ruth said. I'm not hungry. That wasn't a question. Annie picked up the spoon. The first taste was too smooth, too expensive, too careful. Nora's tomato soup had always been sharper, stretched with canned tomatoes, pepper, and whatever herbs she could keep alive on the windowsill. Still, the warmth settled in Annie's stomach, and only then did she realize how long she had been running on anger. Julian stood by the window with his back half turned. He was not watching her eat, but he was listening. Men like him probably learned to listen without seeming to. Annie wondered how many years he had spent hearing only what confirmed what he already believed. Helen Price was still at the table, arranging documents. Samuel came in from the hall after speaking with the deputies. The sheriff's office will remain outside until called in, sir. They've been informed this concerns internal fraud and evidence preservation, not a trespass arrest. Victor looked up from his chair. How generous of you to not have your new guest handcuffed. Annie set down her spoon. Julian spoke before she could. You should be more careful with sarcasm tonight. It may be the only thing you have left. Victor leaned back, pretending comfort. You think this ends with a few old scans and a field girl's performance? You still need proof strong enough to survive court, the board, the press, and every investor who will ask why you let a stranger walk into our house and accuse your own brother. Then we will get proof, Julian said. You always were naive when you wanted to feel righteous. Julian finally turned from the window. And you were always cruelest when you were afraid. Victor's smile thinned. Samuel's phone buzzed again. He checked it, then looked at Helen. The digital archive team found a financial trail tied to the night Nora was terminated. Payments routed through a consulting vendor. Helen stood. How much? $40,000, split into 2 transfers. To whom? Samuel glanced at his notes. Elaine Porter and a security contractor named Miles Grant. Mrs. Ruth set her jaw. Elaine's boy had pneumonia. $40,000 would have looked like a miracle to a scared mother. Annie looked at her. You think she lied because she needed money? I think hungry people can be used by wicked people, Mrs. Ruth said. That doesn't make the lie clean, but it tells you who sharpened the knife. Helen made another note. Can we locate Elaine Porter? Samuel nodded. She lives in Sacramento. I reached a number listed under her daughter. She may agree to speak, but she asked if Victor would be present. Victor let out a short breath. This is becoming pathetic. Julian said, "Call her." Samuel placed the phone on speaker. It rang 4 times. A woman answered with a tired voice. "Hello? Mrs. Porter," Samuel said. "This is Samuel Reed from Vance Wines. I'm here with Mr. Julian Vance, legal counsel, and witnesses. We are reviewing the Nora Carter incident from 18 years ago." There was silence long enough for Annie to hear the fire settle. Then the woman whispered, "I knew this day would come." Julian closed his eyes. Helen leaned toward the phone. "Mrs. Porter, this conversation is being documented. Are you willing to speak voluntarily?" "Yes." "Did you give a statement accusing Nora Carter of removing property from the yeast vault?" Another pause. "Yes." "Was that statement true?" Elaine Porter began to cry. Not loudly, not for sympathy, just the broken sound of someone who had carried one bad choice too long. "No," she said. "It wasn't true." Victor shot to his feet. "This is coercion." One guard moved closer. Julian did not look away from the phone. Elaine continued, words spilling faster now. "My son was sick. Hospital bills were swallowing us. Mr. Victor came to me. He said Nora was already leaving, that she had betrayed the family, that my statement would only confirm what they knew. He said if I helped, my son's treatment would be paid. I told myself it didn't matter because Nora was gone anyway." Mrs. Ruth's face tightened with pain, not surprise. Annie gripped the bowl until it almost tipped. "Did you ever apologize to her?" Elaine's voice broke. "No. I was ashamed. I heard later she had a baby. I didn't know where she went. I'm sorry. I know that's not enough." "No," Annie said. Her voice was quiet. "It isn't," Elaine sobbed once. "I know." Julian stepped closer to the table. "Mrs. Porter, did Victor Vance tell you Nora was pregnant?" "I heard her say it. She came to the staff corridor that morning asking for you. She kept saying she had to tell Julian about the baby. Mr. Victor told security not to let her through. He said if anyone helped her, we'd lose our jobs." Julian looked at Victor. Victor's face had gone still again, but now the stillness looked like a locked door cracking under pressure. Helen spoke into her recorder. "Statement received from Elaine Porter acknowledging false testimony, payment, and knowledge that Nora Carter attempted to reach Julian Vance regarding pregnancy." Samuel ended the call after taking Elaine's contact information for a formal sworn statement. The room held its breath. Annie pushed the soup away. She could not eat anymore. Her mother had gone to that corridor with Annie inside her, begging to be heard. People had watched. People had known. Some were afraid, some were paid, and all of them had survived Nora's ruin better than Nora had. Julian walked toward Victor slowly. "She came to me. Victor said nothing. She was in this house asking for me." Victor's voice was flat. "She was a liability. She was carrying my child. She claimed she was carrying your child." Julian's hand curled once at his side, then opened. "And you decided I had no right to hear that claim. I decided the family had already lost enough." Julian's laugh was low and joyless. "No, you decided I had something you wanted." Victor's eyes flashed. "You had everything. Father's trust, the board's loyalty, the name. Even when I worked harder, you were the golden son. Then Nora came in, and suddenly you were ready to make a cellar woman queen of the house." "A cellar woman," Mrs. Ruth repeated, her voice full of disgust. Victor turned on her. "Yes, a cellar woman. Talented, maybe. Useful, certainly. But she was never going to be one of us." Annie stood so fast the spoon struck the bowl. "She was better than you." Victor looked at her. "At dying poor?" Julian moved before anyone expected it. He did not hit Victor. He did something worse for a man like Victor. He stepped between him and Annie, and spoke with cold clarity. "You will not speak of Nora again unless answering a question." Victor smiled, but his face had lost its color. "You can remove me from a title, Julian. You cannot rewrite blood." Julian's voice lowered. "That is exactly what you tried to do." The door opened, and Dr. Mason returned with a courier receipt. "The samples have reached the lab. They confirm priority handling. We should have the result shortly after dawn. Dawn. The word entered the room like a sentence. Annie looked toward the tall windows. The snow had slowed, but the night was still thick beyond the glass. Somewhere outside, the vines stood in rows under white cover, waiting for morning as if nothing human had ever lied among them. Julian turned to Helen. Prepare a temporary board notice. Victor is suspended, pending investigation. Do not release it yet. I want the DNA result and Mercer's formal statement attached before we move publicly. Helen nodded. Understood. Victor laughed once. You're going public? Julian looked at Annie, then at Nora's notebook. This house went public with a lie for 18 years. It can go public with the truth. Annie felt the words reach her, but she did not let them soften her face. She had learned young that promises sounded warmest before they disappeared. You say that now, she said. Julian turned to her. My mother believed you once. She believed you would honor her. She believed you would hear her voice from their lies. So don't stand here tonight and make yourself sound brave, unless you plan to still be brave when your lawyers tell you how much truth costs. The room went silent. Julian did not look offended. He looked ashamed. You're right, he said. Words are cheap at midnight. Annie nodded once. Then wait for morning. Mrs. Ruth took the tray from Annie's lap and set it aside. Come on, child. You need a dry coat. Julian spoke to Samuel. Find her one. Annie held up a hand. Not fur. Not anything fancy. For the first time, Samuel almost smiled. A plain wool coat, Miss Carter. As Samuel left, Annie sat back down, suddenly drained. Across the room, Victor stared at the old notebook like it was a living enemy. Julian noticed and quietly moved it closer to Helen. Outside, the storm began to loosen its grip on the valley. Inside, no one slept, and beneath the first pale hint of dawn, the blood test that would either end one question or open a deeper wound was already moving toward them. Dawn came slowly over Vance Estate, not bright, not gentle, just a thin gray light spreading across the snow-covered vines. The guests who remained looked worn down by the night. Some sat in silence with untouched coffee. Others stood near the windows, speaking in low voices as if volume itself might make them responsible for what they had heard. Annie had not slept. Someone had found her a plain wool coat, dark blue, a little too large in the shoulders. She kept Nora's box in her lap, and Nora's notebook on the table where Helen Price could see it. Every few minutes, Annie checked that it was still there. She hated herself for doing it. But trust was not something she could put on like a warm coat. Julian stood near the fireplace, one hand against the mantel. He had removed his bow tie hours earlier. His shirt sleeves were rolled once at the cuffs, and for the first time, he looked less like the chairman of Vance Wines and more like a tired man waiting for a verdict he could not influence. Victor had been moved to a chair near the far wall. 2 deputies had arrived and now stood nearby, not arresting him yet, but making sure he understood the difference between being watched by staff and being watched by law. He still tried to appear bored. It did not work. Samuel entered the salon at 6:17 a.m. with his phone in one hand and Dr. Mason behind him. Nobody had to ask. The room knew from Samuel's face. Julian turned first. Annie did not move. Mrs. Ruth sat beside her, one hand folded over Annie's wrist. Breathe, baby, she said quietly. I am. No, you're holding your breath and calling it courage. Annie let out air she had not realized she was keeping. Dr. Mason stepped forward. The preliminary DNA result has been confirmed by the lab under expedited legal procedure. A full certified report will follow, but the result is conclusive. Victor looked away. Julian's voice came out low. Say it. Dr. Mason looked at Annie, then back at Julian. Annie Rose Carter is your biological daughter, Mr. Vance. The words did not explode. They landed. For Annie, the room seemed to narrow to the sound of her own heartbeat. She had imagined this sentence in anger, in prayer, in nightmares. She had thought it would feel like victory. Instead, it felt like a door opening onto a room full of everything she had never had. Julian did not speak. His face lost all its remaining hardness at once, and what stood there was grief stripped of elegance. He looked at Annie as if seeing the years arranged around her, a baby he never held, a child he never walked to school, a girl learning to read menus for her sick mother, an 18-year-old kneeling in snow because every proper door had failed her. He took one step toward her, then stopped. That small stop mattered. He wanted to go to her, but he knew wanting was not permission. "Annie," he said. She looked down at the box. So she told the truth. Yes, my whole life she told the truth. Yes. Annie's eyes filled, but she did not let the tears fall yet. And nobody believed her. Julian closed his eyes. "I didn't believe her. That's worse." "I know." "No," she said, standing now. "You keep saying you know, but you don't. You don't know what it's like to watch your mother choose between medicine and rent. You don't know what it's like to hear people call her difficult because she wouldn't take charity from the same kind of people who stole from her. You don't know what it's like to ask about your father and see her face shut like a door." Julian took it. Every word. Annie's voice shook harder. "You missed birthdays. Fine. You missed Christmas. Fine. But she missed being honored while she was alive. She missed hearing you say you were wrong. She missed one person in this house standing up and saying Nora Carter was not a thief." The last word broke. Mrs. Ruth stood, but Annie held up a hand. She was not finished. "I didn't come here because I wanted your last name. I don't even know if I want you. I came because my mother died with a lie tied around her neck, and I wanted somebody rich enough to tie it there to finally take it off." No one moved. Julian's voice was rough when he answered, "Then that is what I will do first." Victor laughed from the wall, soft and poisonous. Touching, truly. "But before everyone starts rewriting history, remember this. A blood test does not prove Nora was innocent. It proves Julian was careless." Julian turned toward him, and the room felt the temperature change. Helen Price spoke before Julian could. "The blood test is not the only evidence, Mr. Vance. We have the access logs, the missing pages, Elaine Porter's recorded statement, Daniel Mercer's statement, and Nora Carter's original authorship notes." Victor's smile stayed, but it had begun to die at the edges. "Statements can be challenged. Records can be questioned. Scans can be disputed. I hope you all understand what will happen if you drag this into public. Investors will panic. The board will fracture. Every competitor in California will smell blood." Annie looked at Julian. There it was. The cost she had warned him about. Julian did not hesitate this time. "Samuel," he said, "call the board chair. Tell him there will be an emergency meeting at 9. Helen, prepare a public statement. Not a polished one, a true one." Victor stood. "You fool." Julian ignored him. "Dr. Mason, preserve the DNA report under seal until counsel attaches it properly. Mrs. Ruth, if you are willing, I would like you present at the meeting as a witness to Nora's work." Mrs. Ruth stared at him for a moment. "Don't invite me to decorate your conscience, Mr. Vance. I'm not. Good. Because I don't dress up lies for rich folks. I'm asking you to help correct one." She studied him, then nodded once. "For Nora. Not for you. For Nora," Julian said. Annie watched him carefully. A part of her wanted to reject every word, because rejection was safer than hope. But another part, younger and more wounded, had waited 18 years for a man to say her mother's name with shame instead of accusation. Julian faced the room. The remaining guests, staff, deputies, lawyers, and family associates turned toward him. "My daughter will not leave this house under suspicion," he said. The word daughter moved through the room like a match struck in darkness. Annie's chest tightened. Julian continued. "Nora Carter's work will be reviewed, credited, and restored. Victor Vance is suspended from all authority effective immediately. Pending investigation, if any member of this company helped bury the truth, they will have one chance to come forward before we find them." Victor's mask slipped fully then. "You think she'll love you for this? You think the girl will call you father because you put on a show?" Julian looked at Annie. "No." The answer was simple. Then he turned back to Victor. "And that may be the first honest thing I have understood tonight." The deputies stepped closer to Victor as Helen handed them copies of the preliminary evidence. Victor did not fight. Men like him rarely fought with their hands. He adjusted his cuff, lifted his chin, and walked between them toward the hall, still trying to look like he was leaving by choice. As he passed Annie, He lowered his voice. Your mother should have stayed gone. Annie looked straight at him. She came back in me. For the first time that night, Victor had no answer. The deputies took him out. Silence followed, but it was different now. Not empty, not safe, just honest enough to hurt. Julian stood across from Annie with 18 years between them and no way to cross them quickly. I will make the statement today, he said, publicly. Annie nodded. Good. And after that? She cut him off. After that, you keep telling the truth. That's all you get to promise me right now. He accepted it. All right. Mrs. Ruth reached for Nora's notebook and placed it gently back into Annie's box. Come on, child. Morning's here. Annie looked through the tall windows. The snow had stopped. Beyond the glass, the vineyards lay quiet under pale light, each row stretching out like a page waiting to be written correctly. For 18 years, Nora Carter's story had been buried beneath the Vance name. By noon, the world would hear it spoken aloud. By 8:30, the grand hall had been cleared of flowers, empty glasses, and the last traces of celebration. The auction banners still hung from the balcony, black and gold, praising Vance Black Reserve as the pride of a century. No one had taken them down yet, and that made them look less like decoration and more like evidence. Annie stood near the back of the room while staff arranged chairs for the emergency board meeting. She still wore the plain wool coat Samuel had found for her. Her boots had dried in patches, leaving pale stains of mud around the soles. She kept waiting for someone to tell her to leave, to wait outside, to use a service entrance. Nobody did. That should have comforted her. It didn't. Mrs. Ruth handed her a paper cup of coffee from the staff kitchen. Drink this slow. It's strong enough to argue with God. Annie took it. Thank you. You said that about 6 times tonight. My mama raised me right. She did more than that. Annie looked toward the front of the hall. Julian stood with Helen Price and Samuel, reading the statement they had drafted. Every few lines, he crossed something out and rewrote it by hand. Not because the lawyers objected, because he did. Helen said, Mr. Vance, the phrase racial prejudice will create immediate press escalation. Julian did not look up. Good. It may affect investor confidence. Nora Carter's reputation was destroyed to protect investor confidence. Find a different objection. Helen paused, then nodded. I have none. Annie heard that and looked into her coffee before anyone could read her face. At 9, the board members began arriving on video and in person. Some had been at the auction and looked as if they wished they had left earlier. Others appeared on the large screen from New York, Chicago, and London, still in morning shirts or late-night fatigue. They were men and women used to polished reports, not muddy girls, old notebooks, and dead women returning through evidence. Julian took his seat at the head of the long table. Annie expected to be placed somewhere behind him, like a witness waiting to be called. Instead, he looked at Samuel. Bring another chair beside Mrs. Ruth. Annie stiffened. I can stand. Julian turned to her. You can. You shouldn't have to. It was a careful sentence. Not warm enough to demand gratitude. Not grand enough to be a performance. Annie sat beside Mrs. Ruth. The board chair, a thin man named Warren Ellison, appeared on the center screen from Manhattan. Julian, we understand there was an incident after the auction. Before we proceed, I must say the timing is deeply unfortunate, Mrs. Ruth muttered. Truth rarely checks a calendar. A few people heard. Warren pretended not to. Julian placed Nora's notebook, the DNA summary, the access logs, and the scanned missing pages on the table. This is not an incident. It is a correction, 18 years late. Warren's expression tightened. Let us avoid emotional phrasing until facts are established. Julian looked at him. Facts are established enough for this meeting. Helen walked the board through the evidence. Nora's authorship notes, the denied vault access under her credential, Victor's executive override, the missing camera footage, the payments to Elaine Porter and Miles Grant, Daniel Mercer's statement, Elaine's confession, and the DNA confirmation proving Annie Rose Carter was Julian's daughter. On the screen, one board member removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes. Another whispered to someone off camera. Warren stayed very still. When Helen finished, Warren said, "This creates serious exposure." Annie almost laughed. Exposure. Not injustice. Not theft. Not a woman dying poor, while her work, made them rich. Exposure. Julian heard it too. Yes. The truth tends to expose lies. Warren leaned forward. Julian, I am not minimizing the personal dimension, but we have a fiduciary responsibility. If we issue a public statement too quickly, we risk lawsuits, brand devaluation, regulatory inquiries, and shareholder action. Annie stood. Mrs. Ruth reached for her wrist but did not stop her. I'm sorry, Annie said, though her voice made it clear she wasn't. Can I ask something? Warren blinked. And you are? Julian's eyes hardened. She is Annie Carter. My question is simple, Annie said. When my mother was accused, did anyone worry that her life might lose value? Or does value only matter when it belongs to a brand? No one answered. She looked around the table, not with rage now, but with the exhaustion of a girl who had finally seen how grown people dressed cowardice in business language. My mother didn't have shareholders. She had rent. She had medicine. She had a child. She had a name. And this company took the one thing she could have carried with pride. Warren's mouth moved, but no words came quickly enough. Julian spoke quietly. Sit down, Annie, unless you want to continue. She looked at him. I'm done. She sat. Julian turned back to the board. Victor is suspended pending formal termination and criminal review. All documents related to Nora Carter will be preserved and handed to outside counsel. We will issue a public statement at noon, Warren said. I strongly advise we delay. No. Julian. No. Julian repeated. I have delayed 18 years. A board member in London, an older woman named Margaret Hale, leaned toward her camera. What will the statement say? Julian picked up the handwritten page. It will say Nora Carter was falsely accused. It will say the original Black Reserve fermentation method came from her work. It will say Vance Wines profited from that work while allowing her name to be buried under a lie. It will say Victor Vance has been removed from authority. It will say Annie Carter is my daughter, if she permits that part to be included. All eyes moved to Annie. She hated it. Julian looked at her, not the board. That is your choice. The room waited. Annie thought of Nora in the rented room, coughing into a towel so Annie wouldn't hear. Nora stirring soup with one hand and writing ratios with the other. Nora saying, Your name is not a thing people give you, baby. It's a thing you carry. Annie lifted her chin. You can say I'm your daughter, but you will say my name is Annie Rose Carter. Julian nodded. Yes, and you will say I am Nora Carter's daughter before you say I am yours. For the first time that morning, something like respect moved across Margaret Hale's face. Julian wrote the line down. I will. Warren exhaled. This will be catastrophic. Mrs. Ruth looked at the screen. No, sir. Catastrophe is what happened to Nora. This is housekeeping. A few staff members near the wall looked down to hide smiles. Julian stood. The vote is advisory. As chairman and controlling shareholder, I am moving forward. Warren's face darkened. You may survive the truth, Julian. The company may not. Julian looked at the auction banner above the hall, then at Annie. If a company cannot survive telling the truth about the woman who gave it its soul, then it deserves to lose what the lie built. No one spoke after that. At 11:45, cameras were arranged in the same hall where bidders had applauded the night before. Reporters filled the back rows, murmuring into phones. Employees gathered along the sides. Mrs. Ruth sat in the front row beside Annie, wearing her winter coat and church gloves, hands folded over the handle of her cane. Julian stepped to the podium. Annie stood behind him, not beside him, because she chose it that way. Nora's notebook rested in her arms. Julian looked once at her before facing the cameras. My name is Julian Vance, he began, voice steady. Last night, a young woman named Annie Rose Carter came to my gate carrying a glass of wine, a box of memories, and a truth this house should have heard 18 years ago. The cameras clicked. Annie held the notebook tighter. Julian continued. Before I say anything about my company, I will say her mother's name, Nora Carter. At the sound of it, Annie closed her eyes. Not because justice was finished, because, at last, it had begun. The name did not echo through the hall. It settled there. Nora Carter. For 18 years, it had been spoken in whispers by workers, in accusations by executives, and in grief by a daughter who had learned to protect it with both hands. Now it came from the mouth of the man who once had the power to save it and failed. Julian looked down at the statement, then folded it once and set it aside. Helen Price, standing near the wall, tensed. Samuel noticed but did not move. The lawyers had prepared him to speak carefully. Julian had decided careful was what allowed lies to live long lives. Nora Carter was not a thief, he said. She was not a traitor to Vance Wines. She did not steal our work. We stole hers. The cameras flashed harder. A reporter raised her hand. Mr. Vance, are you saying the company knowingly profited from stolen intellectual property? Julian did not hide behind the microphone. I am saying evidence uncovered last night shows Nora Carter created the original fermentation method behind Black Reserve. Her work was taken, her name was removed, and false accusations were used to destroy her credibility. Another reporter called out, "Who was responsible?" Julian looked toward the side of the hall where Victor's empty chair remained from the board meeting. Victor Vance has been suspended from all authority and removed from operational control pending criminal and civil investigation. Evidence has been turned over to outside counsel and law enforcement. The hall broke into overlapping questions. Did you know? Is it true Annie Carter is your daughter? How long has Vance Wines known? Will the Black Reserve label be recalled? Julian lifted one hand. The room quieted slowly. I did not know Annie existed until last night, he said. That does not excuse me. Nora tried to reach me. I believed what I was told because it was easier than asking harder questions. My failure was not fraud, but it was still failure. Pride can be an accomplice even when it does not sign the papers. Annie stared at the back of his head. She had expected him to protect himself. Not completely, maybe, but enough to leave himself a clean corner to stand in. Instead, he had stepped into the dirt with the rest of them. It did not heal anything, but it told her he knew there was dirt. A reporter near the aisle turned toward Annie. Miss Carter, did you come here seeking financial compensation? Mrs. Ruth's eyes narrowed before Annie even moved. Julian turned slightly, but he did not answer for her. Annie stepped toward the second microphone. Her hands tightened around Nora's notebook. She had never spoken in front of cameras before. She had spoken to foremen, nurses, landlords, bus drivers, and funeral clerks. Cameras were different, but not as different as people pretended. They were just another set of eyes deciding what a poor black girl was allowed to be. No, Annie said. I came here because my mother died with your headlines calling her a thief. The reporter lowered her pen. Annie continued. I worked in these fields. I heard people praise Black Reserve like it came out of the walls of this mansion. But it came from my mother's mind, her nose, her patience, her hands. I don't want anybody to make her sound like a mistake that can be cleaned up with a check. The words left her steadier than she felt. Someone asked, What do you want then? Annie looked at Julian, then at the cameras, her name on the truth. Julian's jaw tightened, but this time not in anger. He turned back to the podium. Effective immediately, he said, Vance Black Reserve will be retired. The wine produced from Nora Carter's original method will be released under a new name, Nora Carter Reserve. A sound moved through the hall. Some surprise, some approval, some panic from people who understood what rebranding meant at that level. Julian continued. Every future bottle will state that the original fermentation method came from Nora Carter's work. A portion of profits from all existing Black Reserve holdings will be placed into a restitution fund, reviewed independently, to compensate those harmed by the cover-up, including former workers pressured into silence. Helen Price wrote quickly, even she had not known he would say all of that. And, Julian added, Vance Wines will establish the Nora Carter Fellowship for Black women and women of color in viticulture, fermentation, science, and agricultural work. Not as charity, as a debt. Annie looked down at the notebook before the cameras could catch her face too closely. A debt. It was still smaller than a life, but it was not nothing. Mrs. Ruth whispered. She would have rolled her eyes at all this fuss. Annie almost laughed, then corrected the wine. Exactly. The press conference ended only after Helen stepped in and promised written documentation, a follow-up briefing, and access to legal filings when available. Reporters tried to reach Annie, but Samuel formed a quiet barrier without making her feel trapped. Miss Carter, he said, this way, if you'd like some air. Annie nodded. He led her and Mrs. Ruth through a side corridor toward the east terrace. Julian followed a few steps behind but did not force himself into their space. That was the first decent thing he had done without being told. Outside, the snow had melted in thin lines where the morning sun touched stone. The vineyard rows stretched beyond the terrace, white and brown and still. From here, the estate looked peaceful. Annie knew better now. Beautiful places could hide ugly histories if enough people were paid to polish them. Mrs. Ruth buttoned her coat. "I need to sit before my knees start filing complaints." Samuel pulled a chair from under the covered terrace table. "Mrs. Ruth," she looked at him. "You always this polite? Or is this a crisis special?" Samuel's mouth moved faintly. "My mother believed manners were free, ma'am, and should therefore be used generously." Mrs. Ruth sat. "Your mother had sense." Annie stood at the terrace rail, Nora's notebook pressed against her chest. Julian stopped beside the doorway, leaving several feet between them. "You can come closer," Annie said without looking back. "I'm not going to break." Julian stepped forward, slow. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Annie asked, "Why did you keep making it?" He knew what she meant. "Black Reserve?" She nodded. "If it reminded you of her." "Because I was angry. Because every success felt like proof I had survived her. Because I told myself the wine belonged to the family, not to the woman I thought had betrayed me." "That's ugly." "Yes. At least you know. I know more this morning than I did last night." Annie turned to him. "That doesn't make you wise." "No, it makes me late." She looked out at the vines again. "My mama used to say late truth is still better than a well-dressed lie." Julian's eyes lowered. "She said things like that when she was angry. She said things like that when she was right." A quiet passed between them, not soft, but less sharp. Julian said, "I would like to see where she lived. When you're ready. Not today if you don't want that. Not as a performance. I need to know what her life became after this house turned her away." Annie's first instinct was no. He did not deserve to walk through her mother's last rooms. He did not deserve to see the chipped mug, the folded blanket, the small jars lined by the window. Then she thought of Nora, who never feared the truth even when it hurt her. "Someday," Annie said. Julian nodded. "Someday." Samuel stepped onto the terrace again, phone in hand. "Sir, outside counsel has confirmed the sheriff's office is prepared to take Victor's formal statement. They also found Miles Grant. He's asking whether cooperation will reduce charges." Julian's expression hardened. "Tell them he can start by telling the truth." Samuel nodded and left. Annie watched Julian's face close at the mention of Victor. "He was your brother." "He is my brother." "That makes it harder?" "It makes it more shameful." She understood that more than she wanted to. Family wounds had roots. They did not pull clean. Mrs. Ruth looked from one to the other. "Both of you listen to an old woman. Truth opened the door today. But don't mistake an open door for a healed house. That takes work. Sweeping. Repair. Some rooms you'll want to avoid, but you'll have to walk in anyway." Julian said, "Yes, ma'am." Annie looked at him. "You say that like you mean it." "I do. We'll see." He accepted it. "Yes, you will." By late afternoon, the first headlines appeared. Nora Carter's name spread faster than any Vance press release ever had. Some called it a scandal. Some called it justice. Some asked how many other women had built legacies they were never allowed to enter. Annie did not read them all. She sat in the quiet library with Mrs. Ruth, the wooden box open on her lap, and took out the lavender sprig her mother had saved. It had lost most of its scent, but when Annie pressed it between her fingers, something faint remained. Memory, stubborn and dry, but still there. Julian stood at the door, holding 2 cups of coffee, unsure whether he was welcome. Annie looked up. After a moment, she said, "You can put mine on the table." He did. It was not forgiveness. It was not family, but it was the first ordinary thing he had been allowed to do for her. And for that day, it was enough. By evening, the public statement had moved beyond Napa. It traveled through financial networks, wine journals, national news, and the kind of talk shows that usually cared more about celebrity divorces than fermentation notes. Nora Carter's photograph, the one Annie had carried in the box, appeared on screens across the country. Some outlets called her a forgotten genius. Some called the scandal a reckoning. Others, more careful and colder, called it an allegation under review. Annie hated that word. Allegation. It sounded like a clean white cloth thrown over a body. She sat in the library, Nora's notebook open on her knees, while Samuel stood near the door taking quiet calls. Mrs. Ruth had fallen asleep in an armchair with her cane resting against one leg, her mouth slightly open, her church gloves still on. Annie had tried to cover her with a blanket. Mrs. Ruth had opened one eye and said, "Don't fuss over me like I'm dead," then fallen asleep again. Julian had gone to meet with outside counsel, board representatives, and the sheriff. He had asked Annie if she wanted to be present. She said no, not because she was afraid, but because there were only so many rooms a person could stand in while strangers discussed her mother's suffering like a liability. At 7:30, Samuel ended a call and came closer. "Miss Carter," Annie looked up. "Did something happen?" "Yes, Miles Grant has agreed to give a statement." "The security contractor?" Samuel nodded. "He was on duty the night your mother was accused. He says he will speak only if Mr. Vance is present and if he has legal protection." Annie closed the notebook. Of course he wants protection. People often find courage after they run out of options. She studied Samuel. He had worked for Julian for years, maybe decades. Quiet, controlled, loyal. She still did not know whether loyalty made him trustworthy or dangerous. "Did you know my mother?" she asked. Samuel's face changed. "Not much. Enough." "Yes." Annie waited. He folded his hands in front of him. "I was not Mr. Vance's assistant then. I worked under the estate director. I saw Nora in the cellar often. She was respected by the workers, less respected by men who disliked needing her." "Did you believe she stole?" Samuel looked toward the sleeping Mrs. Ruth, then back to Annie. "At the time, I believed the file. That's not what I asked." "No," he said. "I did not believe it in my gut. But I was young enough to think my gut had no authority." Annie looked down at the notebook. "And now?" "Now I know silence can become a signature." That answer stayed with her. The door opened before she could respond. Julian stood there without his jacket, sleeves rolled, face drawn. He looked at Samuel first, then Annie. "Miles Grant is on a secure video call in the conference room," he said. "You do not have to listen." Annie stood. "Yes, I do." Mrs. Ruth stirred awake as if the sentence had tugged her up. "And then I'm coming too." "You were asleep," Annie said. "I was resting my eyes in a hostile environment." Julian did not argue. He led them down a quieter hallway to a conference room overlooking the dark vineyard. Helen Price was already there, along with 2 lawyers and a deputy sheriff. On the screen was a man in his late 50s with a thick neck, pale skin, and the uneasy look of someone who had spent years hoping age would erase memory. Helen began. "Mr. Grant, you understand this statement is being recorded?" "I understand. You were contracted for security at Vance Estate 18 years ago?" "Yes." "Were you on duty the night Nora Carter was accused of stealing proprietary yeast culture?" Grant rubbed both hands over his face. "Yes." Julian stood at the end of the table. "Tell the truth." Grant gave a humorless laugh. "Easy for you to say now." Annie stepped forward. "It was never easy for my mother." Grant looked at her, and whatever defense he had prepared weakened. "You're her daughter." "Yes." He swallowed. "I'm sorry." Annie said nothing. Grant looked away first. "Victor Vance gave me instructions that night. He said there was a possible internal theft, and he needed the cameras in the yeast vault corridor disabled for a short maintenance window. I told him all shutdowns had to be logged. He said he'd handle the logs." Helen asked, "Did he?" "He gave me an override code and cash. 10,000 that night, another 10 later through a contractor account." The deputy wrote quickly. "What happened after the cameras went dark?" Helen asked. Grant's jaw worked. "Victor went into the vault. He had a folder and a small cooler. He came out with papers tucked inside his jacket. Later, he told me if anyone asked, Nora Carter had been seen near the vault with a package." Julian gripped the back of a chair. "Did you see Nora enter the vault?" "No." "Did she remove yeast culture?" "No." "Did you see her steal anything?" "No." The three answers fell like nails driven into a coffin, but not Nora's. The lies. Annie's throat tightened. Did she come back? Grant looked at her. After they accused her, Annie said. Did she come back to the estate? Yes. Julian went still. Grant continued, quieter now. Next morning, she was at the east service gate. Pregnant, though I didn't know how far along. Crying, but not wild. She kept asking for Mr. Julian. Victor told us she was not to enter under any condition. Julian's voice was barely audible. Was I informed? Grant shook his head. Not by us. Victor said you already knew and wanted her gone. Annie closed her eyes. Her mother had been there. Again and again. The story returned to the same cruelty. Nora standing outside a gate, carrying the truth in her body, while men inside discussed access. Mrs. Ruth spoke, her voice low. Did Nora say anything when they turned her away? Grant looked ashamed. She said, "Tell him I didn't leave. Tell him they made me disappear." No one moved. Julian turned from the screen and walked to the window. His reflection looked older in the glass. Grant said, I should have said something. I know that. I had kids. I needed the money. Victor scared people. Mrs. Ruth answered before Annie could. Fear explains a sin. It doesn't wash it. Grant nodded. No, ma'am. Helen finished with chain of custody questions, payment details, names, dates, and confirmation that Grant would sign a sworn statement. When the call ended, the conference room felt smaller. Julian remained at the window. Annie watched his reflection. She came to your gate. Yes. She asked for you. Yes. And you were inside. He turned then. Yes. There were no defenses left. Not good ones. Annie wanted to ask why he had not searched harder, why love had not made him suspicious, why anger had been easier than trust. But she already knew part of the answer. Her mother had told her once while washing jars in a cracked sink, some men would rather be wounded than wrong. Julian had been both. Helen gathered her papers. With Grant's statement, we now have direct testimony of evidence tampering, witness coaching, and obstruction. Combined with the payment records and digital logs, outside counsel believes criminal referral is strong. Julian nodded. Then file it. A lawyer cleared his throat. Mr. Vance, before proceeding, you should understand the board may push for a settlement framework that avoids criminal spectacle. Civil recovery, termination, internal discipline. No, Julian said. Sir, the damage has a name. Nora Carter. The lawyer stopped. Julian continued. For 18 years, this company benefited from making her small. I won't make this small now to make investors comfortable. Annie looked at him, careful not to soften too quickly. But this sentence was not for cameras. No reporters were present. No guests. Only lawyers. Samuel, Mrs. Ruth, and the old truth. Mrs. Ruth nodded once. That's the first sensible thing I've heard from a Vance man all day. Samuel almost smiled again. The deputy left to coordinate formal statements. Helen followed. The room emptied slowly until only Annie, Julian, Mrs. Ruth, and Samuel remained. Julian said to Annie, I want to show you something, if you can bear another room tonight. Annie almost said no from exhaustion alone. Then she saw the look on his face. Not urgency. Not strategy. Shame. What room? The east cellar. Mrs. Ruth's eyes narrowed. Nora's room. Julian nodded. Annie held the notebook against her chest. All right. They walked downstairs, past stone walls and locked racks, into the older part of the estate, where the air changed. Less perfume, less polish, more earth, more barrel, more truth. The east cellar lights came on slowly, one row at a time. Annie stopped at the entrance. She had never been allowed this far. The room smelled like her childhood in pieces. Oak, damp stone, grape skins, yeast, lavender hiding under darkness. She did not need anyone to tell her Nora had worked here. The room still knew. Julian walked to a barrel near the far wall. Its metal tag was old, scratched, nearly unreadable. He wiped dust from it with his thumb. N.C. Trial Set. Annie stared. That's her? Julian nodded. One of her early test barrels. I thought it had been emptied years ago. Samuel checked the inventory sheet mounted nearby. It was marked inactive after the incident. No disposal record. Mrs. Ruth whispered. She left a witness. Julian looked at Annie. Would you like to open it? Annie's hands shook. Not from cold this time. Samuel handed her a small wine thief, the glass tube used to draw a sample from a barrel. Annie had used cheap plastic tubing in kitchens and sheds. This felt heavier, older, but the motion was the same. Nora's motion. Draw gently, waste nothing. Listen before tasting. Annie pulled a small sample and held it under her nose. Thyme rose from the glass. Faded fruit, old oak, wild lavender, thin but alive, and beneath it, something stubborn that had refused to die in the dark. Annie began to cry without sound. Julian did not touch her. Mrs. Ruth did. That's your mama saying she wasn't finished, Mrs. Ruth murmured. Annie took a breath, tasted one drop, and closed her eyes. When she opened them, Julian was watching her like a man afraid to ask for a blessing he did not deserve. Annie wiped her face with the back of her hand. It's damaged, she said. Julian nodded, but not ruined. His voice was quiet. Can it be saved? Annie looked at the barrel, then at Nora's notebook in her arms. With patience, she said. Julian lowered his eyes. In the east cellar, under the old stone house that had swallowed her mother's name, Annie Carter stood before the last living barrel of Nora's work and understood something that hurt and healed at once. Some things could not be brought back, but some things, if tended carefully, had been waiting in the dark. The first sample from Nora's old barrel sat in a narrow glass on the cellar table, dark and quiet under the overhead light. No one drank more after Annie's first taste. It felt wrong to treat it like a curiosity. That wine had waited 18 years in the dark while the world above it lied. Julian stood a few feet away, hands at his sides, looking at the barrel marked NC Trial 7, as if it were a grave and a witness at the same time. Samuel had gone to update Helen Price in the sheriff's office. Mrs. Ruth sat on a low wooden bench near the wall, one palm resting on her cane, her eyes wet but steady. She had known grief long enough not to make noise every time it entered a room. Annie wiped her cheeks with her sleeve and hated that she had cried in front of Julian. She had planned to be strong, clean, unbreakable, but standing in the room where her mother's gift had been born, smelling that stubborn thread of lavender still alive inside the ruined barrel, she understood something simple and cruel. Nora had left more of herself here than anyone deserved. Julian spoke first. I should have come down here. Annie did not look at him. When? 18 years ago. The morning they said she left. The week after. Any day after that. His voice stayed low. I should have walked into this cellar and asked why the wine changed after she was gone. Annie touched the edge of the table. You noticed? Yes. And still you kept selling it. Julian closed his eyes once. Yes. That's what I don't understand. She turned to him now. If you loved her, if you knew the wine changed, why didn't you ask who took something out of it? He looked at the barrel instead of her. Because asking would have meant I still cared. I was angry enough to make not caring feel like strength. Mrs. Ruth let out a tired breath. Pride will let a man freeze to death and call it dignity. Julian accepted that without defense. Annie picked up Nora's notebook and opened to the page about the second silence. Her mother's handwriting looked different down here. Less like evidence. More like a voice returning to its own room. She wrote that wine remembers everything, Annie said. I used to think she meant soil and weather, but she meant people too, didn't she? Julian nodded. Nora believed every hand left something behind. Then, what did Victor leave behind? The question was not about wine. Julian understood. Poison. Annie looked toward the old barrel. And you? He did not answer quickly. That mattered. A rich man could buy apologies by the dozen, but honest shame took longer to form. Absence, he said at last. I left absence. Annie looked down. The word landed where she did not want it to. Absence had sat at every birthday table, every school event, every doctor visit when Nora was too tired to drive and Annie had to call a neighbor. Absence had been the empty chair she pretended not to see. The cellar door opened. Samuel returned with Helen Price and a deputy sheriff. Helen carried a folder. Her voice was careful. Mr. Vance, The sheriff's office has enough to request a formal warrant for Victor's personal office and private storage. Outside counsel advises we proceed immediately before documents can be moved. Do it, Julian said. The deputy nodded. We'll need your written consent for areas under your ownership, sir. You have it. Helen glanced at Annie. There is more. Miles Grant's statement led us to a storage unit in Santa Rosa, leased through a shell company tied to Victor's former assistant. The sheriff's office is securing it now. Victor's former assistant. Annie remembered her mother's warning from years ago. Lies have helpers, baby. The trick is finding out which ones were scared and which ones were paid. What do they think is inside? Annie asked. Helen hesitated. Julian noticed. Tell her. Possibly the original missing pages, Helen said, and correspondence from Nora that never reached Mr. Vance. For a moment, Annie could not speak. More letters. How many times had her mother tried? How many envelopes had left her hands with hope inside them, only to be locked away by the man who wanted her erased? Mrs. Ruth stood slowly. I want to be there when they open it. The deputy looked unsure. Ma'am, this is an active evidence recovery. Mrs. Ruth looked at him over the top of her glasses. Son, I have been active evidence since before you learned to drive. Annie almost smiled despite everything. Julian said, Mrs. Ruth should come if the sheriff permits. Annie too, if she wants. Annie shook her head. No. Everyone looked at her. She tightened her grip on the notebook. Not because I don't care. Because I already know what they'll find. More of my mother begging a locked door to open. I can't watch strangers pull that out of a box tonight. Julian's face softened with pain. He had no right to ask her to comfort. All right, but I want copies, she said. Every page. Not summaries. Not legal descriptions. Her words. Helen nodded. You'll have them. Annie looked at Julian. And if there's anything private, anything she wrote as a woman, and not as a case file, you don't read it first. Julian lowered his head slightly. You do. Me, Annie said. Then I decide. Yes. That yes was quick, but not dismissive. It was obedience, and that unsettled her more than argument would have. The deputy and Helen left. Samuel remained by the door, waiting for instructions. Julian looked at him. Secure the east cellar. No one enters without Annie's permission. Annie frowned. Mine? Julian met her eyes. This was Nora's work. Until we know how to preserve it properly, you decide who touches it. She wanted to say he had no right to give her what should never have been taken, but the barrel sat behind her, alive because no one had cared enough to destroy it. Maybe inheritance sometimes arrived damaged, smelling of dust and old wrongs, and you still had to guard it. Mrs. Ruth can enter, Annie said. Samuel too, if he signs in. Samuel gave a grave nod. Yes, Miss Carter, and no Victor loyalists. Julian's mouth tightened. There will be fewer of those by morning. Mrs. Ruth tapped her cane once. Careful. Roaches scatter when the kitchen light comes on, but they don't all leave the house. Julian looked at her. Then we keep the light on. A phone buzzed. Samuel checked it. Mr. Vance. Victor's attorneys have arrived at the gate. They're demanding access. Julian's face closed. Let them wait with the deputies. They're threatening an injunction. Helen would have had a dozen legal answers. Julian gave a simpler one. Good. Then they can put their threats in writing. Samuel left again. Annie turned back to the barrel. The sample glass still held 1 dark inch of Nora's old wine. Can this be restored? Julian asked. Annie thought before answering. Not to what it was. Too much time passed. Some damage can't be reversed. He nodded as if she were speaking about more than wine. But it can be respected, she added. Stabilized, studied. Maybe blended carefully into the first Nora Carter reserve. Not to hide its flaws, but to carry its memory. Julian looked at her with something like wonder. You hear all that from one taste? I hear what my mother taught me to hear. For the first time, he did not look hurt by being corrected. He looked grateful that Nora still existed somewhere in the way Annie spoke. They climbed back toward the main floor near midnight. The mansion had emptied of guests, leaving staff, lawyers, deputies, and silence. News vans waited beyond the gate. Their lights glowed through the windows like distant fires. In the library, Annie found a stack of printed headlines on the table. Someone had gathered them for Julian. She read the first one before she could stop herself. Forgotten black winemaker behind Vance Empire, daughter claims. Claims. She pushed the paper away. Julian saw. Tomorrow's statement will use stronger language. Tomorrow? Annie asked. You said the truth was going public today. It did. No, a version did. A careful version. The world still thinks my mother's innocence is something to debate. Julian stood still. Annie's exhaustion broke through. Not loud, but sharp. Do you know what people will say tonight? That she slept her way into a cellar. That I showed up for money. That Victor is being sacrificed for a public relations story. That maybe a poor black woman did steal and now everybody's too scared to say it. They'll say all that while sleeping in warm beds. Mrs. Ruth came in behind them but did not interrupt. Julian looked at the headlines. Then he picked up the top page, folded it once, and tore it in half. Annie stared at him. That doesn't change what they wrote. No, he said, but I'm done making room for cowardly language. He turned to Samuel, who had just entered. Schedule another press briefing at 8 tomorrow morning. Not here. In the East Cellar. Samuel paused. The cellar, sir? Yes. The place where Nora worked. Bring the archive scan, the witness statements, the access logs, and the barrel marked NC Trial 7. If the world wants proof, it can stand where she stood. Annie's throat tightened. Julian looked at her. Only if you agree. The room waited. Annie thought of Nora outside the gate, barred from entry. Nora in the cellar, writing warnings no one read. Nora in a rented room, still preserving truth in a box for a daughter who might someday be brave enough to carry it. Yes, Annie said, but her portrait goes up first. Julian nodded. We'll find one. Annie opened the wooden box and took out the faded photograph of Nora in the cellar. She placed it on the table. Use this, she said. This is where she belongs. Julian looked at the photograph for a long time. Then, gently, he picked it up with both hands. By morning, Nora Carter would no longer be a name spoken beside scandal. She would stand in the cellar again, looking out from the wall of the house that had tried to forget her. At 6 in the morning, the East Cellar no longer looked like a room hidden beneath a rich man's house. It looked like a place preparing to testify. Staff moved quietly between barrels, setting lights where cameras could see without burning the old wood into glare. Samuel checked names at the stairway. Helen Price arranged documents on a long table. Nora's scanned authorship pages. The access logs. Elaine Porter's statement. Miles Grant's testimony. Daniel Mercer's signed declaration. The DNA summary. And photographs of the barrel marked N.C. Trial set. Annie stood near the far wall, holding the framed photograph of Nora Carter. The frame was simple black wood. Not gold, not polished silver. Annie had refused anything that made her mother look like decoration. In the photograph, Nora stood in the cellar with one hand resting on a barrel, her head turned slightly as if someone had called her name. There was intelligence in her eyes, and a kind of joy that hurt to look at because Annie had rarely seen that joy before sickness took so much of her. Julian came down the stairs carrying a small brass hook and a level. Annie looked at him. You're doing it yourself? Yes. You have people for that. I had people for too many things. She did not answer, but she stepped aside. Julian placed the hook into the stone wall beside the old barrel. He did not rush. His hands, usually made for signing papers and holding rare glasses, worked carefully with the tool Samuel handed him. When the hook was secure, he took Nora's photograph from Annie. For a moment, neither of them let go. Annie's fingers stayed on the bottom of the frame. Julian's held the sides. She hated being photographed, he said. Annie looked at the picture. She said cameras made people perform. She told me that too. Did she perform with you? Julian shook his head. No, that was one of the reasons I loved her. Annie released the frame first. Julian hung it on the wall. Nora Carter returned to the East Cellar without a speech, without music, without applause. Just the soft click of wood settling against stone. Mrs. Ruth stood behind Annie and whispered, "Welcome home, Nora." Annie swallowed hard and looked away before tears could gather. She had cried enough in this house. At least that was what she told herself. Grief had other plans. By 8 o'clock, Reporters filled the cellar in a tight half-circle. Cameras pointed not at a podium, but at Nora's photograph and the table of evidence. Julian had refused the grand hall this time. He wanted the world to see barrels, stone, records, and the room where the work had been done. Annie stood beside Mrs. Ruth near the first row. She had agreed to be present, but not to speak unless she chose to. Julian did not argue. That, too, was new. Helen opened the briefing with dates, facts, and evidence. Her voice was clean, controlled, impossible to dismiss as emotion. She described the original authorship notes, the missing pages, the camera interruption, the executive override by Victor Vance, the payments to witnesses, the sworn statements, and the DNA confirmation. Then Julian stepped forward. "There are companies that apologize when they are caught," he said. "There are families that call truth a crisis because they prefer the comfort of a lie. I cannot speak for every family or every company. Today I speak for this one." He turned slightly toward Nora's photograph. Nora Carter created the original Black Reserve fermentation method in this cellar 18 years ago. She was falsely accused of theft. Her work was taken. Her name was removed. She was blocked from reaching me when she tried to tell me the truth, including the truth that she was carrying my child. Cameras clicked. No one interrupted. Julian continued. "My brother, Victor Vance, has been removed from all positions of authority in Vance Wines. Evidence has been turned over to law enforcement and outside counsel. We will cooperate fully with criminal and civil proceedings. No settlement will be used to hide the record." A reporter raised her hand. "Mr. Vance, what does this mean for current Black Reserve inventory?" Julian looked toward Annie briefly, then back to the cameras. "All current Black Reserve releases are suspended. Bottles already sold will remain traceable, and the company will issue a formal historical correction with every verified bottle. Future production from the original method will be named Nora Carter Reserve." Another reporter asked, "Will Miss Carter inherit part of Vance Wines?" Annie's body stiffened. Julian's expression cooled. "Miss Carter is not a prize in a succession story. Her legal rights will be handled privately and respectfully. Today is about her mother's name." Annie looked down at her hands. That answer spared her from becoming a headline before she was ready to become anything else. Mrs. Ruth leaned closer. "He learned one thing. One thing isn't much," Annie whispered. "It's more than some folks manage in a lifetime." Helen then announced the Nora Carter Fellowship, the restitution process for harmed workers, and an independent review of past company practices involving labor, credit, and authorship. It was the sort of thing that would take lawyers, auditors, public anger, and time. Annie understood that justice did not become real because someone said it into a microphone. Still, the words were no longer buried. When the briefing ended, reporters tried again to reach Annie. One called, "Miss Carter, do you forgive Mr. Vance?" Annie turned before Samuel could shield her. "No," she said. The cellar went quiet. She continued, "Forgiveness is not a press question. My mother waited 18 years for truth. I can take more than one morning to decide what forgiveness means." No one asked another question. By noon, the sheriff's office confirmed Victor had been formally detained for questioning after documents were recovered from the Santa Rosa storage unit. Helen received the inventory list in the library. Original pages from Nora's notebook. 2 unopened letters addressed to Julian. Copies of payments to witnesses, and a private memo in Victor's handwriting noting that NC must be discredited before JV. Compromises family control. Annie read the memo once. Then again, no, say, not Nora. Not Miss Carter. Just initials. A problem to be managed. She set the page down with care because if she held it too long, she might tear it. Julian stood across the table. "I'm sorry." Annie closed her eyes. "Please stop saying that for things too big for the word." He nodded. "All right." Samuel entered quietly. "Victor's attorneys are requesting a family meeting before charges proceed." Julian's jaw tightened. "No." Samuel waited. Julian looked at Annie. "Unless you want to face him?" "I already did." "Yes, you did." Mrs. Ruth, seated near the window with a cup of coffee, said, "Don't waste your strength wrestling a snake after it's been caught." Annie looked at the recovered letters. "I want to read those first." Julian stepped back. They're yours to read. Helen brought the letters in evidence sleeves. Annie sat alone at the library table while everyone else moved to the far side of the room. She opened the first carefully. Julian, I came again today. They told me you were unavailable. I don't believe that. I think someone is deciding what you are allowed to know. I am tired, but I am not ashamed. If our child is born without your name, that child will still know mine. Annie pressed her hand to her mouth. The second letter was shorter. I loved you. That is not my crime. My crime was believing love could make a house like yours brave. Annie folded the letter and held it against her chest. No one spoke for a long time. Near sunset, Julian walked back down to the east cellar alone. Annie found him there later, standing before Nora's photograph. He was not crying. Men like him often learned not to, but his face carried the strain of someone who had finally stopped looking away. Annie stood beside him, leaving space between them. She wrote you were not brave, Annie said. Julian nodded. She was right. What are you going to do with that? Spend whatever time I have left proving I can become better than she last knew me. Annie studied him. Don't make that sound noble. It's late. It is, and it won't bring her back. No, and I'm not sure I want to be your daughter in any way that matters. His voice softened. You already matter. Whether I am allowed to matter to you is your choice. Annie looked at Nora's picture. That was the hardest answer he could have given her, because it asked for nothing. Outside, evening settled over the vineyard. The snow had begun to melt, feeding the soil in silence. Beneath that soil, roots would take what they could and leave the rest. Annie touched the barrel marked NC Trial 7. Tomorrow, she said, we start stabilizing this. Julian turned to her. We? She did not look at him. For the wine, she said. Not for you. A small breath left him. Almost a laugh, almost a prayer. Understood. Annie stayed beside the barrel, feeling the old wood under her palm. The house had not healed. The name had not been fully restored. The dead had not returned, but Nora Carter was on the wall. Her work was under protection. Her truth was in the record. And Victor Vance, for the first time in 18 years, no longer owned the silence. 3 months later, the first warm wind of spring moved through Napa Valley and shook the new leaves along the Vance vines. Snow was gone from the roads, but Annie still remembered the sound of the Bentley's brakes every time she passed the stone arch gate. Some memories did not leave because the weather changed. The estate had changed, though not in ways that looked grand from the outside. The auction banners were gone. Victor's office had been emptied under legal supervision. His name had been removed from company directories, board documents, and the brass plate outside the executive wing. The case against him had not moved quickly. Rich men rarely fell fast. But for the first time in 18 years, he was answering questions he could not buy his way around. The east cellar had changed most. Nora Carter's photograph now hung on the stone wall beside NC Trial 7. Beneath it was a small bronze plaque Annie had written herself after rejecting 3 polished versions from the communications department. Nora Elaine Carter, winemaker, mother, creator of the original Black Reserve fermentation method. She gave this house its soul. Julian had read the words once, then looked at Annie. It's simple. She was simple to honor, Annie said. You all made it complicated. He had nodded. By then, he had learned not to answer every wound with an apology. That morning, Annie stood at the cellar table with her sleeves rolled up, studying 3 samples from the restored barrel. She wore clean work clothes now, but still work clothes. Denim, boots, a white shirt, and her mother's old grape shears clipped to her belt. She had refused the designer wardrobe Julian's staff tried to send her after the press discovered who she was. I'm not dressing like somebody's investment, she had said. Julian never sent clothes again. He entered the cellar carrying 2 paper cups of coffee and a brown bag from the diner in town. He did not bring a silver tray anymore. Annie had told him trays made breakfast feel like a board meeting. Coffee, he said, setting 1 cup near her elbow. Black, 1 sugar. Annie lifted it and tasted. 2 sugars. Julian stopped. You changed it? No, you remembered wrong. He looked embarrassed enough that she almost smiled. I'll get it right tomorrow, he said. That's what tomorrow is for. He set down the brown bag. Mrs. Ruth said you skipped breakfast. Mrs. Ruth says many things. She said if I let you work on an empty stomach, she'd come down here and correct both of us. Annie opened the bag. Biscuit sandwich. Egg, cheddar, peppered bacon. Not fancy. Warm. She took one bite and said, "You're learning." Slowly. Slowly is better than pretending you already know. Julian looked at the 3 glasses. How is it? Annie wiped her fingers on a napkin and lifted the first sample. She smelled it. Then the second. Then the third. Julian waited without speaking. That, too, was new. In the beginning, he had wanted answers quickly, as if truth could be managed like a meeting. Annie had taught him wine did not care about a billionaire's schedule. "It's stabilizing," she said. "The damage is still there, but it isn't spreading." Julian looked toward Nora's photograph. "That sounds like more than wine." "It usually is." He leaned against the table, leaving space between them. He always left space now. He had taken her to see Nora's last apartment in Oakland 6 weeks earlier and had not touched a thing without asking. He had stood in the small kitchen where Nora made her final bottles and listened while Annie showed him the cracked window, the jars, the folded towel by the door. He had not cried until they reached the car. Annie had seen him through the windshield, head bowed, one hand over his eyes. She did not comfort him, but she did not look away either. Since then, he had shown up in ways that did not make headlines. He met with former workers and listened to stories that made him ashamed. He wrote checks when restitution was owed, but he no longer mistook money for repair. He attended the first Nora Carter Fellowship interviews and stayed quiet while young black women talked about soil science, family farms, and professors who ignored them until they became impossible to ignore. He visited Mrs. Ruth with groceries and carried them into her kitchen despite her saying, "I've been lifting heavier things than you since 1968. And with Annie, he learned smaller things. She hated being interrupted when she smelled wine. She added hot sauce to scrambled eggs. She read every label on medicine bottles because Nora's illness had taught her to distrust vague instructions. She did not like being called brave by strangers. She believed bad coffee was a moral failure. She forgave slowly, if at all. That afternoon, the first official blending session for Nora Carter Reserve took place. Not in the grand hall, not in front of cameras, but in the east cellar with a small group present. Annie, Julian, Mrs. Ruth, Samuel, Helen Price, Harold Finch, and 2 young fellowship recipients who had been invited by Annie, not the company. Harold smelled the sample and gave Annie a respectful nod. "Your mother's structure is holding." Annie looked at Nora's photograph. She knew how to build things that lasted. Mrs. Ruth sat near the wall with a quilt over her knees, and she knew how to raise a child who could finish what she started. Annie looked down quickly, pretending to adjust the glasses. Julian saw but said nothing. When the blend was ready, Annie poured the first small measure and carried it to Nora's photograph. For a moment, no one moved. The cellar smelled of oak, spring soil, old stone, and wild lavender rising faint but clear. Annie lifted the glass. "To Nora Carter," she said. "Not forgotten, not erased, not for sale." Everyone repeated her name. Julian's voice broke slightly on Nora, but he did not hide it. After the tasting, as the others moved upstairs for a simple supper, Annie stayed behind. Julian remained near the door, waiting to see whether she wanted to be alone. "You can stay," she said. He walked back slowly. They stood beside the barrel marked NC Trial 7. Outside the small cellar window, evening settled over the vines. Julian said, "I can't give you back 18 years. Annie traced the edge of the barrel with her fingers. "No, I can't give your mother the apology she deserved while she was alive. No, I can keep telling the truth." She looked at him then. "Even when it costs you." Especially then. Annie studied his face. It was older than it had been the night she knelt in the snow. Or maybe she was only seeing it differently. Not as a gate. Not as a verdict. Just as a man late to his own heart. "I'm still angry," she said. "You should be. I might be angry for a long time. I'll still come back tomorrow." She looked away before her eyes could betray her. "You keep saying things like that." "Then watch what I do." That was the right answer. Not pretty, not easy. Just patient. A few minutes later, Mrs. Ruth called down the stairs. "If you two are finished staring at barrels like they're going to preach, food's getting cold." Annie laughed, sudden and real. Julian looked at her as if the sound had given him something he had no right to keep but would remember anyway. They went upstairs to the old workers' dining room, not the formal one. Annie had chosen it. The table held roast chicken, collard greens. Mrs. Ruth had insisted on making herself mashed potatoes, cornbread, salad, and a tomato soup with too much pepper because Annie said brave soup deserved respect. Samuel poured sweet tea. Helen removed her suit jacket. Harold told a story about a French judge who once mistook California wine for Bordeaux and never recovered his pride. Mrs. Ruth laughed until she coughed, then waved away everyone's concern. Julian sat across from Annie, not at the head of the table. Halfway through dinner, Annie passed him the cornbread without being asked. It was a small thing. He understood that. Near the end of the meal, he said, "Thank you, Annie." She looked at him. "For cornbread? For letting me sit here." She took a slow breath. Around them, conversation continued. Forks moved. Chairs creaked. Somewhere outside, spring wind touched the vines Nora once saved. Annie did not call him Dad, not that night. But when she stood to clear her plate, she paused beside him and said, "Same time tomorrow, Julian. The blend still needs work." He looked up. "Yes," he said softly, "same time tomorrow." And that was where the story truly ended. Not with a perfect family, not with a wound made clean, not with 18 lost years returned like money from a bank. It ended with a daughter who had once knelt in the snow, now standing in the house that tried to erase her mother. It ended with a man learning that love was not a speech but a daily arrival. It ended with Nora Carter's name on the wall, her wine breathing again in the cellar, and her child no longer asking to be seen. Annie had been seen. Now she would decide, one tomorrow at a time, what being found would mean. The lesson of Annie Carter's story is that truth may be buried by power, money, and prejudice, but it does not die. Nora Carter lost her name, her work, and her place in history because others decided a poor black woman was easier to erase than to honor. Yet her love, her talent, and her dignity lived on through her daughter. Annie teaches us that courage is not always loud. Sometimes it is a young woman standing in the cold, asking to be seen. And Julian's journey reminds us that justice is not just admitting the truth once, but choosing to repair what was broken every day after. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.